Cade Mercer didn't know that saving a man's honor would cost him everything: his reputation, his home, and nearly his life. In the shadow of Montana's brutal frontier, where loyalty runs deeper than blood and secrets can destroy whole families, one cowboy stood between truth and devastation. But when the spring thaw arrived, so did the reckoning. A woman abandoned, a child without a father, and whispers that painted the wrong man guilty. This is the story of the longest winter a good man ever endured, and the day he finally stopped running from the fire. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end. The wind came down off the Beartooth Range like a knife looking for bone. It was the kind of cold that made horses turn their backs to the mountains and men pull their hats low, not in greeting, but in survival. Cade Mercer stood in the middle of the Voss ranch yard, his breath forming clouds that vanished before they could rise, watching the dawn break over a landscape that had never promised mercy and never would. He'd been up since 4, same as every morning for the past 8 years. The cattle didn't care about comfort, and neither did Gideon Voss. The old man ran his operation the way his father had: hard, lean, and without apology. 30,000 acres of Montana territory stretched from the ranch house to the foothills, carved from wilderness by men who'd had more grit than good sense. Cade had been 15 when he'd first ridden onto this land, hungry and alone, looking for work that would keep him alive through the winter. Gideon had looked him over with eyes that missed nothing. "You know cattle." "Enough," Cade had answered, which was half true and half prayer. "You know how to keep your mouth shut and your hands working?" "Yes, sir." Gideon had nodded once. "Then you'll do." That was 8 years ago. Now Cade was 23, foreman in all but title, and the man every cowboy on the spread looked to when trouble came calling. He could break a horse that other men gave up on, track a lost steer through country that would swallow a man whole, and work 18 hours straight without complaint. He'd earned his place here the way everything worth having was earned on the frontier, through sweat, silence, and the kind of loyalty that didn't bend. The bunkhouse door creaked open, spilling yellow lamplight across the frozen ground. Tom Wardell stepped out, older than Cade by a decade, with a face weathered by sun and wind until it looked like carved wood. He'd been on the Voss spread longer than anyone except Gideon himself. "Thought I'd find you out here," Tom said, pulling his coat tighter. "You sleep at all?" "Some," Tom grunted, the sound of a man who knew a lie when he heard one but wasn't inclined to push. "Gideon wants the herd counts finished before the thaw hits full. Says we're moving 200 head to the eastern pasture come Sunday." Cade nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. Moving cattle in spring was risky, the ground still frozen in places, rivers swollen with snowmelt, and the herd restless after a winter penned close. But Gideon's instincts about timing were rarely wrong. "Rylan going with us?" Cade asked. Tom's expression shifted, something between amusement and resignation. "You know the answer to that." Cade did. Rylan Voss, Gideon's only son, had never met a day of hard work he couldn't charm his way out of. Where Cade was lean muscle and silent competence, Rylan was easy smiles and quick words, the kind of man who could talk a preacher into buying whiskey and make him feel good about it afterward. At 25, Rylan should have been running the ranch alongside his father. Instead, he spent his days riding into town, playing cards, and spending money faster than the ranch could make it. But he was Gideon's son, and on the frontier that meant something, even when it shouldn't. "I'll handle the counts," Cade said. "Get the boys ready to ride at first light." Tom hesitated, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been concern. "Cade, there's talk coming out of town." Cade went still. "What kind of talk?" "The ugly kind." Tom looked away toward the mountains, as if the words were easier to say when he didn't have to meet Cade's eyes. "About Mara Quinn." The name hit like a fist to the chest, though Cade kept his expression flat. Mara Quinn, 22 years old, with dark hair and darker eyes, and a spine that hadn't broken under the weight of every hard thing life had thrown at her. She'd come to the territory 2 years ago with her brothers, homesteading a piece of land north of town that was more rock than soil. Cade had seen her in town a handful of times, quiet, watchful, the kind of woman who didn't waste words or smiles. He'd also seen her 6 months ago, standing outside the general store with her belly swollen beneath a worn wool coat, her face pale and set in that expression women wore when they were determined not to ask for help, they knew wouldn't come. "What about her?" Cade asked, his voice carefully neutral. Tom shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "She had the baby, a boy. Word is she's alone up there, and folks are asking questions about the father." Cade's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who the father was. So did Rylan. And so did one other person who should have mattered more than anyone else. "People should mind their business," Cade said. "You know they won't." Tom's voice dropped lower. "They're saying things, Cade, about you." The silence that followed was heavy enough to break bones. Cade stared at the eastern horizon, where the sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of copper and ash. He'd always known this day would come. Secrets on the frontier had a short lifespan. Too many eyes, too many long winters with nothing to do but talk. Too many people looking for someone to blame when things went wrong. "Let them talk," Cade said finally. "It's not just talk anymore." Tom's voice carried the weight of a warning. Her brothers rode through town yesterday. They're asking questions, hard questions. Cade knew the Quinn brothers, Declan and Finn, both built like bulls and twice as mean when their temper was up. They'd come west running from something back east. The kind of men who solved problems with their fists first and thought about consequences never. "They come here?" "Not yet, but they will." Cade nodded slowly. He'd faced down rustlers, broken wild horses that wanted to kill him, and spent nights alone in country where one mistake meant freezing to death before morning. He'd learned a long time ago that some things couldn't be outrun or outfought. They could only be endured. "I'll handle it," he said. Tom studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that said he was seeing more than Cade wanted to show. "You've been handling things for that boy since he was old enough to get himself in trouble. Question is, how much longer you plan on carrying his weight?" Before Cade could answer, the ranch house door opened. Rylan Voss stepped out onto the porch, stretching like a man who'd slept well and had no intention of starting the day with anything resembling work. He was handsome in the way that came easy to some men, square jaw, dark hair that always looked just messy enough to seem careless, and eyes that sparkled with the kind of charm that made people want to forgive him before he'd even done anything wrong. "Morning, gentlemen," Rylan called out, his voice carrying that perpetual note of amusement, as if the whole world was a joke only he understood. "Beautiful day for standing around talking, isn't it?" Tom muttered something under his breath and headed back toward the bunkhouse. Cade stayed where he was, watching Rylan cross the yard with the easy confidence of a man who'd never had to earn his place. "You're up early," Cade said. "Couldn't sleep." Rylan stopped beside him, pulling out a cigarette and striking a match against his thumbnail. "Wife's been in a mood, you know how women get." Cade did know. He also knew that Elena Voss had reason to be in a mood, though she probably didn't know the half of it yet. Elena was a rancher's daughter from Wyoming, pretty in a careful way, with blonde hair she kept pinned back and a smile that never quite reached her eyes anymore. She'd married Rylan 2 years ago, probably believing the same lie everyone did, that Gideon's son would eventually grow into the man his father wanted him to be. "Your father wants the herd counts done before Sunday," Cade said, changing the subject before Rylan could go any further down a road Cade had no interest in traveling. Rylan exhaled smoke, watching it curl and disappear into the cold air. "Let the boys handle it. That's what we pay them for. We pay them to work cattle, not to run the ranch." "You're starting to sound like my old man." Rylan grinned, but there was an edge to it now, something sharp beneath the charm. "Not everything needs to be so serious, Cade. Learn to relax a little." Cade held his tongue. There were 1,000 things he could have said, about responsibility, about the men who depended on this ranch for their livelihood, about the fact that Gideon wasn't going to live forever, and someone needed to be ready to take the reins when that day came. But he'd said all of it before, in 100 different ways, and Rylan had smiled and nodded and gone right on doing exactly what he wanted. "I heard about Mara Quinn," Cade said quietly. Rylan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, quick and dark, there and gone like a shadow crossing the sun. "What about her?" "She had the baby, a boy." "Good for her." Rylan took another drag from his cigarette, his tone light, casual, utterly unconcerned. "Shame she ended up alone like that. Whoever the father is, he should have stood up." The words hung in the air between them, and Cade felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd known Rylan for years, had covered for him more times than he could count, Had taken the blame when Rylan got drunk and wrecked the general store, had lied to Gideon about where his son was when he was supposed to be mending fences, had stood between Rylan and every consequence the young man's actions had earned. But this was different. This wasn't a broken window or a missed day of work. This was a woman's life, a child's future, and a weight that should never have fallen on shoulders that didn't put it there. "People are talking," Cade said, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "They're saying it's mine." Rylan met his eyes then, and for just a moment the mask slipped. Beneath the charm and the easy grin was something colder, something calculating. "That's unfortunate." "Rylan, you're a good man, Cade. Everyone knows that. If people want to talk, let them. Talk's cheap." Rylan dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. "Besides, it's not like you're going to tell them different, are you?" The question hung between them, not quite a threat, but not quite anything else either. Cade felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders, familiar and heavy. This was the choice he'd made a long time ago, to protect Rylan, to shield him from his own mistakes, to be the wall between Gideon's son and the consequences of his actions. But standing here in the cold Montana dawn, watching Rylan walk away without a backward glance, Cade felt something shift inside him, a crack in the foundation of a loyalty he'd built his whole life on. "No," Cade said to the empty yard, to the wind, to himself. "I'm not." The day unfolded the way Montana days always did in early spring, cold in the morning, briefly warm at midday, and bitter again by the time the sun started its descent behind the mountains. Cade spent the hours working the herd counts with Tom and two other hands, riding through pastures still patched with snow, checking brands and tallying numbers that Gideon would demand to see by evening. The work was good. It kept his hands busy and his mind focused on things that made sense: cattle that needed feed, fences that needed mending, horses that needed breaking. Simple problems with simple solutions. By the time they rode back to the ranch, the sun was already dropping low, painting the mountains in shades of amber and violet. Cade unsaddled his horse, rubbed the animal down, and made sure it had feed and water before heading toward the bunkhouse. He was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from too many hours in the saddle and too few hours of sleep. But before he could reach the door, he heard voices coming from the ranch house, raised, angry voices that carried across the yard with the clarity of shattering glass. Cade stopped, his instincts telling him to keep walking, to mind his own business, to let whatever was happening in that house stay there. But one of those voices belonged to Elena Voss, and she was crying. He changed direction. The ranch house was built from logs and stone, solid and imposing, a monument to Gideon's vision of what a man could build if he was willing to bleed for it. Cade had been inside a handful of times, usually when Gideon wanted to discuss ranch business over whiskey and cigars, but he'd never felt comfortable there. It was too big, too fine, too far removed from the bunkhouse and the barn and the places where real work got done. He knocked on the door, firm but not aggressive. The voices inside went quiet. Footsteps approached, and then the door swung open to reveal Elena Voss. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair coming loose from its pins, and her face bore the kind of expression Cade had seen before, on animals caught in traps, on men who'd just realized they'd bet more than they could afford to lose. "Cade," her voice was barely above a whisper. "This isn't a good time." I heard shouting, wanted to make sure everything was all right. "Everything's fine." The lie was so transparent it hurt to hear. "Rylan and we were just talking." Behind her, Rylan appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with barely controlled anger. "We're handling it, Cade. You can go." But Cade didn't move. He looked at Elena, at the way she was holding herself like something fragile, trying not to break. And he made a decision he knew he'd probably regret. "Mrs. Voss, if you need anything—" "She doesn't need anything," Rylan cut in, his voice sharp. "And she sure as hell doesn't need you playing hero." "Rylan." Elena's voice was quiet but firm. She turned to look at her husband, and something passed between them that Cade couldn't read. "He's just trying to help. He's overstaying his welcome." Cade held Rylan's gaze, something dangerous stirring in his chest. For years, he'd swallowed his pride, bitten his tongue, and done whatever it took to keep the peace. But there was a limit to what a man could carry, and Cade was starting to feel the weight of it crushing down on him. "I'll go," he said finally. "But if you change your mind, Mrs. Voss, you know where to find me." He turned and walked away before either of them could respond, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Behind him, the door slammed shut, and the voices started up again, quieter this time, but no less venomous. That night, Cade lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the other men sleeping around him. Tom snored like a freight train. Young Billy Patterson muttered in his sleep. Somewhere outside, a coyote called to the moon. Cade's mind wouldn't settle. It kept circling back to the same place, the same problem, the same impossible choice. He thought about Mara Quinn, alone in that homestead with a newborn baby and winter barely over. He thought about the Quinn brothers, looking for someone to blame. He thought about Elena Voss, trapped in a marriage that was slowly breaking her into pieces. He thought about Gideon, who'd given him a chance when no one else would, who trusted him more than his own son. And he thought about Rylan, standing on that porch with his easy smile and his empty promises, letting Cade carry the weight of his sins without a second thought. Somewhere in the darkness, Tom's voice drifted over. "You still awake?" "Yeah." "You know what you're going to do?" Cade was quiet for a long moment. "No. The right thing ain't always the easy thing." "I know." Tom shifted in his bunk, the frame creaking. "You've been carrying that boy's weight for a long time, Cade. Question is, how much more can you take before it breaks you?" Cade didn't have an answer for that. He just lay there in the dark, listening to the wind outside and wondering when exactly loyalty had turned into a cage. The next morning came too soon. Cade was up before dawn again, going through the familiar motions of another day on the ranch. But something had changed. He could feel it in the air, in the way the other hands looked at him when they thought he wasn't paying attention, in the way conversation stopped when he walked into the barn. The talk had spread. By mid-morning, it was everywhere. Cade could see it in Tom's careful neutrality, in Billy's uncomfortable silence, in the way the new hands whispered and stared. The story had taken root, fed by gossip and watered by speculation, and now it was growing wild. Cade Mercer and Mara Quinn. A secret affair. A child born out of wedlock. A man who'd abandoned his responsibilities and left a woman to face the consequences alone. None of it was true. All of it was believed. Cade was in the barn, checking tack and trying to ignore the weight of eyes on his back, when Gideon found him. The old man stood in the doorway, his shadow falling long across the straw-covered floor. He was tall and lean, weathered by decades of Montana winters, with eyes that had seen everything worth seeing and hadn't been impressed by most of it. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "Got a minute?" Cade straightened, setting down the bridle he'd been oiling. "Yes, sir." Gideon walked into the barn, his boots making solid sounds on the packed earth. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been hearing things about you and the Quinn girl." Cade kept his expression neutral. "I expect you have." "True?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and unavoidable. Cade could have lied, should have lied. It would have been easier, simpler, safer. But when he looked into Gideon's eyes, he found he couldn't do it. "No, sir. It's not true." Gideon studied him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure." "Then who's the father?" And there it was. The question Cade had known was coming, the one he'd been dreading since the day he'd first learned about Mara's situation. The truth sat on his tongue like a stone, heavy and impossible to swallow. He could tell Gideon everything, about Rylan, about the lies, about the way his son had seduced a vulnerable woman and then abandoned her without a second thought. But if he did, he'd destroy the illusion Gideon had built his life on. The belief that his son, for all his flaws, would eventually step up and become the man he needed to be. The hope that the Voss legacy would continue through blood and name. Cade had spent 8 years earning Gideon's trust. He wasn't sure he could survive losing it. "I don't know, sir," he said quietly. "That's her business, not mine." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "You protecting someone?" "I'm telling you the truth." "Are you?" The silence that followed was the kind that could break a man. Cade held Gideon's gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to flinch. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles couldn't be won, only endured. Finally, Gideon nodded, though his expression remained hard. "All right, but I'll tell you this, Cade. People are talking, and talk has a way of turning into something more. You need to be careful." I will. And if you're lying to me, Gideon let the sentence hang unfinished, the threat implicit. Then he turned and walked out of the barn, leaving Cade alone with the horses and the smell of leather and hay. Cade exhaled slowly, his hands shaking with the effort of holding everything in. He just lied to the man who'd given him everything. He'd chosen Ryland's future over his own honor, and he had no idea if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. That afternoon, the Quinn brothers came. Cade was working on the eastern fence line when he saw them riding across the valley, two dark figures against the pale spring grass. He recognized them immediately. Declan and Finn Quinn, mounted on horses that looked like they'd been ridden hard and fed poorly, carrying themselves with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from men who'd learned early that the world respected force more than reason. Tom, working beside Cade, saw them too. Company. I see them. Want me to stay? Cade considered it, then shook his head. Well, no, this is my problem. Cade, go back to the barn, Tom. Tell the boys to keep working. Tom hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and good sense. Finally, he nodded and mounted his horse, riding away before the Quinn brothers got close enough to object. Cade watched him go, then turned to face the approaching riders. They reined in 20 feet away, and for a moment nobody spoke. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of sage and snowmelt. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, searching for prey. Declan Quinn dismounted first. He was the older of the two, built like a blacksmith, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and left unfinished. Finn stayed on his horse, one hand resting on the rifle slung across his saddle. Mercer, Declan said, his voice flat and dangerous. Declan, Finn. Cade kept his hands visible, relaxed but ready. Something I can help you with? You can start by telling me why my sister's living alone with a bastard child while you're out here pretending nothing happened. Cade kept his expression neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Declan took a step closer, his hands curling into fists. Whole town's saying you got Mara pregnant and left her to deal with it alone. That true? No. You calling my sister a liar? I'm saying the town's wrong. Finn spoke up from his horse, his voice quieter, but no less threatening. Then who's the father? I don't know. Bullshit. Declan spat the word like a curse. You expect us to believe that? Cade met his eyes, saw the rage there, the need for someone to blame, someone to hurt. He understood it. If he had a sister in Mara's situation, he'd be looking for blood too. Believe what you want, Cade said, but I'm telling you the truth. I didn't touch your sister. Then why is everyone saying you did? Because people need someone to blame, and I'm convenient. Declan studied him, and Cade could see the calculation happening behind those hard eyes. The older Quinn brother was angry, but he wasn't stupid. He was trying to decide if Cade was telling the truth or just playing him. You protecting someone? Declan asked, echoing Gideon's question from earlier. Cade said nothing. That's what I thought. Declan turned his head and spat into the grass. You want to be a coward. That's your business. But I'm telling you right now, my sister deserves better. That baby deserves better. And if I find out you're lying to me, there won't be enough of you left to bury. He remounted his horse with quick, angry movements. Finn followed suit, and together they wheeled their horses around and galloped back across the valley, leaving Cade standing alone by the fence line. When they were gone, Cade let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He'd faced down angry men before, but this was different. This wasn't about cattle or land or money. This was about honor, family, and the kind of debt that could only be paid in blood. And Cade knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like winter cold, that this was only the beginning. That evening, Cade sought out Ryland. He found him in the stable, supposedly checking on his horse, but more likely hiding from whatever chores his father had assigned him. Ryland looked up when Cade entered, his expression already defensive. If you're here to lecture me, the Quinn brothers came by, Cade said, cutting him off. Ryland went still. What did they want? What do you think they wanted? Cade's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. They wanted to know why their sister's alone with a baby while the father walks free. What did you tell them? The same thing I told your father. Nothing. Ryland exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Good. That's good. Is it? Cade stepped closer, his patience finally fraying. How long do you think this can last, Rylan? How long before someone figures out the truth? No one's going to figure out anything because there's nothing to figure out. Rylan's voice took on that familiar tone of easy confidence, the one he used when he was trying to charm his way out of trouble. People talk, Cade. That's what they do. But talk fades. Give it a few months and they'll have moved on to something else. And what about Mara? What about her baby? What about them? Rylan shrugged, as if the question itself was unreasonable. She made her choices. I'm not responsible for what happened after. The words hit Cade like a physical blow. He'd known Rylan was selfish, had known he lacked the kind of moral compass that guided better men, but hearing it said so plainly, with such casual cruelty, made something crack inside him. You are responsible, Cade said quietly. That's your son. Keep your voice down. Rylan glanced toward the stable door, suddenly nervous. You want someone to hear? Maybe someone should. Don't. The charm was gone now, replaced by something harder and more desperate. Don't do this, Cade. You tell people and it destroys everything. My marriage, my father's opinion of me, the whole future of this ranch. Is that what you want? What I want is for you to do the right thing. The right thing? Rylan laughed, but there was no humor in it. The right thing for who? You tell the truth and I lose everything. Elena leaves me. My father disowns me. The whole town turns against me. And for what? So Mara can have my name? You think that helps anyone? It's better than lying. Is it? Rylan stepped closer, his eyes hard. You've been lying for me since we were kids, Cade. Every time I screwed up, you were there to cover for me. You took the blame when I got drunk and wrecked the general store. You lied to my father about where I was when I was supposed to be working. You've spent 8 years protecting me, and now you want to act like you've got some moral high ground? The accusation stung because it was true. Cade had been complicit in Rylan's deceptions for years, had enabled his worst impulses in the name of loyalty and friendship. But this was different. This wasn't a broken window or a missed day of work. This was a life, a child, a woman who deserved better than the hand she'd been dealt. I'm done, Cade said quietly. Rylan froze. What? I'm done protecting you. I'm done lying for you. I'm done carrying your weight. Cade, no. Cade shook his head, something inside him finally breaking free. I've given you 8 years, Rylan. I've bled for you, lied for you, sacrificed my own honor to protect yours. And you haven't learned a damn thing. You're still the same selfish, reckless boy you were when we were kids. The only difference is now your mistakes have real consequences. Rylan's face went pale, then flushed with anger. You ungrateful bastard! My father gave you everything, this job, this life, a place to belong, and this is how you repay him? By threatening to destroy his son? I'm not threatening anything. I'm just telling you I'm done. If you tell people the truth, you'll regret it. The threat hung in the air between them, clear and unmistakable. Cade looked at the man he'd once called a friend, the boy he'd protected like a brother, and saw nothing there worth saving. Maybe, Cade said quietly, but I'll regret it less than I regret this. He turned and walked out of the stable, leaving Rylan standing alone in the shadows. That night, Cade couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the bunkhouse and feeling like a stranger in his own life. Everything he'd built over the past 8 years, his place on the ranch, his reputation, his relationship with Gideon, all of it was built on a foundation of lies and misplaced loyalty. And now that foundation was crumbling. He thought about Mara Quinn, alone in that homestead with a newborn baby. He'd never spoken to her, not really. Their paths had crossed a handful of times in town, brief moments of awkward eye contact and polite nods. But he knew her story the way everyone knew everyone's story on the frontier, through gossip, speculation, and the kind of small-town omniscience that came from too many people living too close together. She deserved better than this. Better than Rylan, better than the lies, better than a whole town pointing fingers at the wrong man. Cade made a decision. Tomorrow, he would ride out to the Quinn homestead. He would look Mara in the eye and tell her the truth. Not because it would fix anything, it wouldn't. Not because it would make things easier, it would make them infinitely harder. But because it was the right thing to do, and he'd spent too long already doing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. The decision settled over him like snow, cold, inevitable, and strangely peaceful. For the first time in months, Cade felt like he could breathe. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bunkhouse windows. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of new growth and fresh starts. But on the Montana frontier, spring also brought floods, storms, and the kind of change that could sweep away everything a man thought he knew. Cade closed his eyes and waited for morning, knowing that when the sun rose, nothing would ever be the same again. Dawn came with the smell of rain. Cade was already saddled and riding before the first light broke over the mountains, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as his horse picked its way across the valley. He'd left a note for Tom, short, vague, enough to keep questions at bay for a few hours. The Quinn homestead was a 2-hour ride north through country that was still more winter than spring, and Cade wanted to be back before Gideon started asking where he'd gone. The land rolled out before him in waves of pale grass and dark stone, marked here and there by stands of pine that had survived the winter's worst. This was hard country, the kind that broke weak men and tested strong ones. The Quinns had chosen a piece of it that was harder than most: rocky soil, sparse water, and a wind that never seemed to stop blowing. As Cade rode, his mind kept circling back to the conversation in the stable. Ryland's face when he'd threatened him, the cold calculation behind those familiar eyes. Cade had always known that Ryland was selfish, but he'd never quite understood how deep that selfishness ran. Until last night. The boy he'd protected all these years had grown into a man who would sacrifice anyone to protect himself. The homestead came into view just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. It was a small cabin, rough-built and weathered, with a lean-to for animals and a garden plot that looked like it had been carved from stone with nothing but determination and a shovel. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and gray against the brightening sky. Cade dismounted 50 yards out and walked the rest of the way, leading his horse. He didn't want to spook anyone. Out here, a rider approaching fast meant trouble more often than not. The door opened before he reached it. Mara Quinn stood in the doorway, a rifle held low but ready. Her dark hair pulled back and her face set in an expression that was equal parts wariness and exhaustion. She looked older than he remembered, the kind of aging that came from too many sleepless nights and too much weight carried alone. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tension beneath it. "This is a surprise." "Ma'am." Cade stopped 10 feet from the door, keeping his hands visible. "I apologize for showing up unannounced. I was hoping we could talk." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing. Then she lowered the rifle slightly. "About what?" "About what people are saying, about the truth." Something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe, or suspicion. "The truth hasn't mattered much so far. Why would it start now?" "Because it should, and because I'm tired of lies." Mara looked past him, scanning the valley behind him, as if checking for other riders. Finding none, she stepped back from the doorway. "You'd better come in then, but I'm keeping the rifle close." The cabin was small and spare, warmed by a fire that crackled in a stone hearth. A cradle sat near the warmth, and Cade could see the baby sleeping inside, wrapped in blankets that looked like they'd been mended more than once. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular kind of poverty that came from making do with less than enough. Mara set the rifle against the wall but stayed within reach of it. "Say what you came to say." Cade removed his hat, turning it in his hands. Now that he was here, the words felt heavier than he'd expected. "The talk in town. About me being the father, it's not true." "I know that." Her voice was flat, matter of fact. "I've been saying it since the beginning, but nobody wants to listen. I know who the real father is." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Mara went very still, her eyes locked on his face. "Do you?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you came here to tell me this because you deserve to know that I'm not going to keep protecting him." Mara let out a breath that might have been a laugh or might have been something harder. "You've been protecting him all along, haven't you? That's why people think it's you, because whoever the real father is, he's letting you take the blame." "Yes." "And now you've had a change of heart?" There was an edge to her voice now, something bitter and sharp. "What happened, Mr. Mercer? Did your conscience finally catch up with you?" Cade met her eyes. "Something like that." "Well, I appreciate the thought, but it's too late. The damage is done. My brothers think you're responsible. The whole town thinks you're responsible. My reputation's already destroyed. What difference does the truth make now? It makes a difference to me. Does it? Mara crossed her arms, her expression hard. Because from where I'm standing, the only thing the truth does is make things worse. If people find out you've been lying all this time, they'll turn on you. If they find out who the real father is, they'll turn on him. And me? I'll still be the woman who got herself into trouble, only now I'll be the woman who caused a scandal on top of it. She was right, and Cade knew it. The truth wouldn't fix anything. It would just redistribute the blame, spread the damage to more people, make enemies where there had only been gossip before. But carrying the lie had become a weight he couldn't bear anymore. His name is Ryland Voss, Cade said quietly. Mara closed her eyes, and for a moment, all the hardness left her face. She looked young and tired and utterly defeated. I know. You know? Of course I know. She opened her eyes again, and there was a weariness in them that made Cade's chest ache. I've always known. He made it very clear from the beginning that he had no intention of acknowledging the baby, said it would ruin his marriage, ruin his life, gave me money, and told me to keep quiet. And you did. What choice did I have? Her voice rose slightly, anger bleeding through the exhaustion. He's Gideon Voss's son. He has money, power, respect. I'm a homesteader on rocky land with 2 brothers who'd kill him if they knew the truth. You think the law would take my side? You think this town would believe me over him? Cade had no answer for that. She was right again. On the frontier, justice wasn't blind. It had eyes, and those eyes favored men with money and names that carried weight. But you, Mara continued, her gaze boring into him, you could have told the truth. You could have cleared your name. Instead, you let everyone think you were the father. Why? Because I thought I was protecting him, and because I owed Gideon Voss. You don't owe him your honor. I know that now. Mara walked to the cradle and looked down at the sleeping baby. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer. His name is Samuel. He's 6 weeks old. He has his father's eyes, though I don't suppose Ryland Voss will ever look at him long enough to notice. Cade moved closer, looking down at the child. The baby was small, red-faced, with dark hair and tiny fists curled against his chest. He looked fragile and impossibly vulnerable, a life that depended entirely on the strength of a woman the world had already decided to abandon. He deserves better than this, Cade said. We all deserve better than we get. Mara reached down and adjusted the blanket, her movements gentle despite the hardness in her voice. But deserving doesn't change what is. I'm going to tell people the truth. Don't. The word came out sharp and immediate. Don't you dare. Cade looked at her, startled. But you think the truth helps me? You think it helps Samuel? Mara turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing. If you tell people that Ryland Voss is the father, one of 2 things happens. Either people believe you, and then my brothers go after him and someone ends up dead, or people don't believe you, and then you look like a liar and a coward, and I look like a woman trying to trap a rich man. Either way, Samuel grows up knowing his father wanted nothing to do with him, and his mother was the center of a scandal that destroyed families. So what do you want me to do? Just keep lying? I want you to leave it alone. Her voice dropped, but the intensity remained. I want you to go back to that ranch and keep your head down and let time do what it does. People will talk for a while, and then they'll move on. In a year, 2 years, this will all be old news. Samuel will grow up knowing his mother loves him, and that's all that matters. And you'll raise him alone? On this land, with no help? I've managed so far. Barely. Cade gestured around the cabin, at the thin walls and the mended blankets, and the poverty that clung to everything like frost. You can't do this alone, Mara. Not through another winter, not with a child. Then what do you suggest? There was challenge in her voice now, and something that might have been desperation. Should I march into town and demand Ryland Voss acknowledge his bastard? Should I beg for charity from people who've already decided I'm not worth their time? What exactly do you think I should do? Before Cade could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Both of them turned toward the door, tension snapping through the air like a live wire. Mara grabbed the rifle, and Cade's hand went to the pistol at his hip. The door burst open, and Declan Quinn filled the frame, his face dark with fury. Behind him, Finn appeared, equally grim. Step away from my sister, Declan said, his his voice low and dangerous. Cade raised his hand slowly. I'm not here to cause trouble. Too late for that. Declan's eyes flicked to Mara. You all right? I'm fine, she said quickly. He was just leaving. Not yet, he's not. Declan moved into the cabin, forcing Cade to back up. Finn followed, closing the door behind them. We had a conversation yesterday, Mercer. I told you what would happen if I found out you were lying to me. I wasn't lying. Then what the hell are you doing here? It was Mara who answered, her voice cutting through the tension. He came to tell me the truth. Declan's eyes narrowed. What truth? Mara hesitated, and in that moment Cade saw the choice forming on her face. She could tell her brothers everything, unleash them on Ryland Voss, and let whatever happened happen. Or she could protect the lie for reasons that Cade was only beginning to understand. The truth that he's not the father, she said finally. He came to make sure I knew that, even though everyone in town is saying otherwise. Finn spoke up, his voice quieter than his brother's, but no less intense. If he's not the father, then who is? That's none of your business, Mara said. The hell it's not. Declan took a step toward Cade. You're protecting someone. You were yesterday, and you are now. Who is it? Cade held his gaze, his mind racing. He could tell them. Right here, right now, he could give them Ryland's name and step aside. Let the Quinn brothers do what they were going to do anyway. It would solve the problem, or at least transfer it to someone who deserved it more. But it would also mean blood. Death, probably. And a scandal that would tear apart more lives than just Ryland's. I'm not protecting anyone, Cade said. I'm just trying to set the record straight. By showing up at my sister's cabin alone? Declan's hand moved to the knife at his belt. That doesn't look like setting records straight. That looks like a man trying to cover his tracks. Declan, stop. Mara stepped between them, the rifle still in her hands. He's telling the truth. He's not the father, and he's not here to cause trouble. Just let him leave. Not until I get answers. You're not going to get them from him. Mara's voice was firm now, with an authority that surprised Cade. And you're not going to get them from me. What happened is over. Who the father is doesn't change anything. Samuel is mine to raise, and I'll do it my way. Declan looked at his sister, something complicated passing across his face. You're protecting someone too. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just tired of this whole mess and want it to be over. She turned to Cade. You should go, Mr. Mercer. Before this gets worse. Cade nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was understanding there and something else, a shared recognition of the impossible positions they'd both been forced into. He moved toward the door, giving Declan and Finn a wide berth. At the threshold, he paused. If you need anything, we won't, Declan said flatly. Stay away from my sister. Cade stepped outside into the cold morning air, his heart pounding. Behind him, he could hear voices rising again, argument picking up where it had been interrupted. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a stone. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was high, and the day had turned warm enough that the last patches of snow were starting to melt. Tom was waiting for him in the yard, his expression troubled. Where'd you go? Riding? For 3 hours without telling anyone? Tom shook his head. Gideon's looking for you, and he's not happy. Cade dismounted and handed the reins to Billy, who'd appeared from the barn. What does he want? Didn't say. Just said to find you the minute you got back. Cade walked toward the ranch house, his boots heavy on the packed earth. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, the other hands watching, whispering, judging. The talk had spread faster than he'd thought possible, fed by gossip and speculation and the human need to make sense of complicated things with simple stories. Gideon was in his office, standing by the window with his back to the door. He didn't turn when Cade entered. Close the door. Cade did, then stood waiting. The silence stretched out, heavy and deliberate. Finally, Gideon spoke. I hear you rode out to the Quinn homestead this morning. Cade's stomach dropped. Yes, sir. Why? To talk to Mara Quinn, to try and clear things up. Gideon turned then, his face unreadable. And did you? Clear things up? I told her the truth, that I'm not the father. Did she believe you? She already knew. Something flickered in Gideon's eyes. Then why do people think it's you? Cade hesitated, caught between the truth and the lie he'd been carrying. Because someone let them think it. Who? The question hung in the air like a noose. Cade could feel the moment stretching, could feel the weight of the choice he'd already made bearing down on him. He'd told Mara he was done protecting Rylan, had meant it. But standing here in Gideon's office, looking at the man who'd given him everything, he felt the old loyalty pulling at him like a riptide. I don't know, he said finally. Gideon's expression hardened. You're lying to me. No, sir. Yes, you are. You've been lying to me since this whole thing started. Gideon moved closer, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. I gave you a chance 8 years ago, when you had nothing. I gave you a job, a place, respect. I trusted you more than my own blood sometimes. And this is how you repay that trust? With lies? I never meant... I don't care what you meant. Gideon's voice cracked like a whip. I care what you did. You've been protecting someone, and I want to know who. The door opened behind them. Ryland stood there, his expression carefully concerned. Father, I heard shouting. Is everything... Get out, Gideon said without taking his eyes off Cade. But now. Ryland hesitated, his gaze flicking between his father and Cade. Then he backed out and closed the door softly. Gideon waited until the footsteps faded before speaking again. Last chance, Cade. Tell me the truth, or you're done here. Cade felt the world narrowing to this single moment. He could tell Gideon everything, about Rylan, about Mara, about years of lies and misplaced loyalty. It would cost him Gideon's trust, but he'd already lost that. It would destroy Rylan, but Rylan had destroyed plenty already. Or he could keep lying, keep carrying the weight, and lose everything anyway. I can't tell you what you want to hear, Cade said quietly. Gideon's face went cold. Then pack your things and be gone by sunset. You're not welcome here anymore. The words hit like a physical blow. Cade stood there, feeling 8 years of his life crumbling around him. The ranch, the work, the place he'd built for himself. All of it gone in a handful of words. Sir? I said get out. Cade turned and walked out of the office, his chest tight and his mind reeling. In the hallway, he nearly collided with Rylan, who was leaning against the wall with studied casualness. That sounded rough, Rylan said. Cade looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but a hollow emptiness where his loyalty used to be. You heard. Hard not to. Rylan pushed off the wall. Look, I'm sorry it came to this, but you have to understand your father just fired me. I know, and that's unfortunate, but maybe it's for the best. You can start fresh somewhere else, away from all this talk. Away from your mess, you mean? Rylan's expression tightened. It's not my mess if you kept your mouth shut like you should have. I should have told the truth from the beginning. But you didn't. And now you've lost your job, your reputation, everything. Was it worth it, Cade? All that honor you're so proud of? Cade stepped closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You're going to regret this. Is that a threat? It's a promise. One way or another, the truth is going to come out. And when it does, you won't have me to hide behind anymore. He pushed past Rylan and walked out of the house, into the afternoon sunlight that felt too bright and too harsh. The bunkhouse was quiet when he entered, most of the hands still out working. Cade moved to his bunk and started gathering his things. Clothes, gear, the few personal items he'd accumulated over 8 years of living in one place. Tom appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Heard what happened. Word travels fast. Always does. Tom came inside, closing the door behind him. Gideon's making a mistake. Gideon's protecting his son. By throwing out the best foreman he's ever had? That's not protection, that's stupidity. Cade shoved a shirt into his pack, not trusting himself to speak. The anger was there, hot and immediate, but beneath it was something colder and more painful. Betrayal, loss, the particular kind of grief that came from watching something you'd built with your own hands get torn apart. Where will you go? Tom asked. Don't know yet. You could try the Morrison spread. They're always looking for good hands. Maybe. Cade buckled his pack closed and straightened. Tom, I need you to do something for me. Name it. Keep an eye on Mara Quinn and her baby. Make sure they have what they need to get through till summer. Tom studied him for a long moment. You really aren't the father, are you? No? But you know who is. Cade didn't answer. He didn't need to. Tom nodded slowly. I'll look after them. You have my word. Thank you. Cade. Tom hesitated, then pushed forward. Whatever you're planning to do, think it through first. Anger makes men stupid. I'm not angry. I'm done. He walked out of the bunkhouse with his pack slung over his shoulder and his rifle in hand. The sun was starting its descent toward the western peaks, painting the mountains in shades of gold and shadow. It was beautiful, the kind of evening that reminded a man why he'd come to this country in the first place. Cade saddled his horse, checked the cinch twice, and mounted up. As he rode out of the ranch yard, he could feel eyes on him, the other hands watching, curious and careful. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth seeing anymore. The trail took him east, away from the mountains and toward the open prairie. He rode until the ranch disappeared behind a roll in the land, and then he kept riding. The horse settled into an easy lope, and Cade let his mind go quiet, focusing on the rhythm of hooves on hard ground and the wind in his face. He made camp that night beside a creek, building a small fire and boiling coffee that tasted like dirt and exhaustion. The stars came out overhead, scattered across the sky like thrown salt, indifferent and eternal. Cade sat with his back against a rock and stared into the flames, thinking about choices and consequences, and the way a man's life could change in the space of a single conversation. He'd lost everything today. His job, his home, his reputation. But he'd also lost something heavier, the burden of carrying another man's sins. And sitting there under the Montana sky, Cade felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt free. The next morning brought clouds and the promise of rain. Cade broke camp early and rode on, still heading east, still with no clear destination in mind. The land changed as he traveled, the mountains giving way to rolling hills and then to plains that stretched to the horizon. This was open country, the kind where a man could see trouble coming from miles away. By midday, he reached a small town, barely more than a trading post, a saloon, and a handful of buildings clustered around a muddy main street. Cade stopped at the saloon, tied his horse outside, and went in to get out of the wind. The place was dark and smelled of spilled beer and tobacco. A few men sat at tables, playing cards or nursing drinks. Behind the bar, a gray-haired woman with shrewd eyes looked him over. What'll it be? Whiskey, and information if you have it. She poured the drink and slid it across the bar. What kind of information? I'm looking for work, cattle, horses, anything that pays honest. Honest's in short supply around here, but work isn't. She leaned against the bar, studying him. You look like you know your way around a ranch. I do. There's a spread about 10 miles north. Big operation run by a man named Garrett Cole. He's always looking for hands who can actually work instead of just talk about it. Cade downed the whiskey, feeling it burn all the way down. Obliged. Word of advice? The woman's voice dropped lower. Whatever you're running from, make sure it doesn't follow you. Cole doesn't tolerate drama on his ranch. I'm not running from anything. Sure you're not. She gave him a look that said she'd heard that line before. Drink up and ride safe, cowboy. Cade left the saloon and rode north, following the directions the woman had given him. The land here was different from the Voss spread, flatter, with more water and better grass. By late afternoon, he could see buildings in the distance, a ranch house, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and good management. He was still a mile out when riders appeared on the horizon, 3 of them, coming fast. Cade reined in his horse and waited, his hand resting on his rifle but not drawing it. The riders approached and circled him, their horses snorting and stamping. The man in the lead was older, maybe 50, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen enough of the world to be wary. You lost? No, sir. I'm looking for Garrett Cole. Heard he might be hiring. You heard right. I'm Cole. The man looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired and fired 100 men. You got a name? Cade Mercer. Something flickered in Cole's expression. Mercer. I've heard that name. You work for Gideon Voss? Used to. What happened? Cade met his eyes. We had a disagreement about loyalty. Cole was quiet for a moment, considering. You any good with cattle? Best you'll find. Modest too, I see. but there was a hint of amusement in Cole's voice. All right, Mercer, I'll give you a trial. 2 weeks. If you're as good as you say, you've got a job. If you're not, you ride on. Fair? Fair. Good. Follow me. We'll get you settled. As they rode toward the ranch, Cade felt the weight on his chest lighten just slightly. He'd lost one home today. Maybe, with time and work and luck, he could build another. But as the sun set behind them and the first drops of rain began to fall, Cade knew that the past wasn't done with him yet. Somewhere back in that valley, there was a woman raising a child alone, a man hiding behind lies, and a truth that would eventually demand to be heard. The storm was coming, and when it hit, no one would be able to hide from it. 2 weeks became a month, and the month stretched into spring proper. Cade worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life, throwing himself into the labor with a fury that surprised even the most seasoned hands on the Cole ranch. He was up before dawn and working past dark, mending fences that didn't need mending, breaking horses that had already been broken, doing anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from circling back to the valley he'd left behind. Garrett Cole watched him with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read people the way other men read weather patterns. On a Thursday morning in late April, he found Cade in the corral working with a young stallion that had more spirit than sense. You trying to work yourself to death or just running from something you can't outrun? Cade didn't break his focus on the horse. Just earning my keep, sir. You've earned it twice over. Cole leaned against the fence, his weathered hands resting on the top rail. Best hand I've had in years, which makes me wonder what Gideon Voss was thinking, letting you go. He had his reasons. I'm sure he did. Question is whether they were good ones. Cole was quiet for a moment, watching Cade guide the horse through its paces. Got a telegram yesterday. From Tom Wardell, over at the Voss spread. Cade's hands tightened on the lead rope, but he kept his voice steady. What did it say? Said to tell you that the woman and child are being looked after. Said you'd know what that meant. Relief flooded through Cade's chest, so intense it almost staggered him. Obliged to you for telling me. Also said things are getting worse over there. Gideon's planning a big cattle drive next month. Spring roundup to the railhead. Says Ryland's been acting strange, making deals with men nobody knows. Cade finally looked up, meeting Cole's eyes. That's not my concern anymore. Isn't it? Cole's expression was knowing. You can lie to yourself all you want, Mercer, but you're not fooling me. Whatever happened over there, it's eating you alive. I made my choice. Maybe. But choices have a way of following a man, whether he wants them to or not. Cole pushed off the fence. I'm riding into town tomorrow to meet with some buyers. You're coming with me. It wasn't a request. The town was bigger than the trading post Cade had stopped at weeks ago, with proper buildings and a telegraph office, and streets that had been planned rather than just happening. Cole went to handle his business while Cade found himself drawn to the general store, needing supplies and wanting the distraction of normal commerce. He was examining saddle leather when he heard the voice behind him. Cade Mercer. Didn't expect to see you this far from home. Cade turned to find Elena Voss standing in the doorway, a basket over her arm, and an expression on her face that was equal parts surprise and something harder to read. She looked thinner than he remembered, with shadows under her eyes that no amount of careful grooming could hide. Mrs. Voss. Cade removed his hat. I could say the same about you. I'm visiting my sister. She married a banker here last fall. Elena moved into the store, her movements careful and deliberate. How have you been? Well enough. You? That's a complicated question. She set her basket on the counter and turned to face him fully. Things have changed since you left. Not for the better. Cade felt his stomach tighten. What's happened? Elena glanced at the shopkeeper, who was pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. She lowered her voice. Not here. Can we talk somewhere private? They walked to a small park at the edge of town, where a few scraggly trees provided shade and the illusion of privacy. Elena sat on a bench, her hands folded in her lap, and for a long moment she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. Ryland's planning something. Something bad. What kind of bad? I don't know exactly. He's been meeting with men at odd hours, taking trips to town without explanation. He thinks I don't notice, but I do. She looked up at Cade, her eyes desperate. And Gideon's given him ownership stake in the ranch, 20%, Said it was time Rylan learned responsibility. Cade's jaw tightened. When? 3 weeks ago. Right after you left. Elena's voice cracked slightly. Gideon thought it would make Rylan grow up, make him take things seriously. But it's had the opposite effect. He's gotten worse, Cade. Secretive and cruel, and I don't know who he is anymore. I'm not sure I ever did. Have you told Gideon? And say what? That I suspect my husband of something but have no proof? That I married a man I don't trust? She let out a bitter laugh. Gideon already thinks I'm weak. This would just confirm it. Cade sat down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Elena, whatever Rylan's planning, it's not your fault. Isn't it? I married him. I believed all his promises, all his charm. I thought I could change him, make him into the man I wanted him to be. She brushed at her eyes angrily. I was such a fool. You were young. We all were. Not you. You always saw him clearly. That's why you protected him all those years, isn't it? Because you knew what he was and you were trying to keep him from destroying himself. Cade didn't answer. The truth was more complicated than that, tangled up in loyalty and debt and the particular kind of blindness that came from wanting someone to be better than they were. Elena turned to look at him directly. The talk in town. About you and Mara Quinn. It's not true, is it? No. But you let people believe it. Yes. Why? Cade met her eyes and saw that she already knew. Saw that she'd probably known for a long time, had just been too afraid to admit it to herself. Because I was a fool too, he said quietly. Elena closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there were tears streaming down her face. It's his baby. Yes. Does Gideon know? No. She stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could hold herself together through sheer force of will. I have to go. My sister will be wondering where I am. Elena, don't. She held up a hand, stopping him. Don't tell me it'll be all right, or that things will work out, or any of the other lies people tell when the truth is too ugly to face. Just promise me something. What? When whatever Rylan's planning comes to light, and it will, I can feel it, don't let Gideon lose everything because of his son's mistakes. The ranch, the men who depend on it, all of it. Don't let Rylan destroy it all. I'm not sure I can stop him. You're the only one who can. She picked up her basket and started walking away, then paused. He's scared of you, Cade. That's why he wanted you gone. Because you're the only person who's ever stood up to him, the only one who's ever seen through his lies. Don't let him win. She disappeared around the corner, leaving Cade alone with the weight of her words and the growing certainty that the storm he'd been expecting was about to break. Cole found him an hour later, sitting on that same bench and staring at nothing. The older man sat down without asking, pulled out a flask, and took a long drink before offering it to Cade. Ran into someone you know? You could say that. Bad news? The worst kind. The kind you can see coming but can't do anything to stop. Cade took the flask and drank, the whiskey burning away some of the cold that had settled in his chest. Cole was quiet for a moment. You want to tell me what this is really about? Cade did. The whole story spilled out. Rylan and Mara, the lies and the accusations, Gideon's trust and Cade's misplaced loyalty, Elena's warning, and the growing certainty that something terrible was building in that valley. By the time he finished, the sun was starting its descent, and Cole's expression had gone from interested to grim. That's a hell of a mess. I know. And you think Rylan's planning something during the spring drive? I don't know, but Elena's not the type to imagine things. If she says he's up to something, he is. Cole stood, his movements deliberate. Then we'd better find out what. We? You think I'm going to let one of my best hands ride into trouble alone? Cole's expression was stern, but not unkind. Besides, Gideon Voss is a hard man, but he's a fair one. He doesn't deserve to lose his ranch because his son's a snake. This isn't your fight. It is now. You work for me, which means your troubles are my troubles. Cole held out his hand. We ride back tomorrow. I'll make some inquiries, see what I can find out about these men Rylan's been meeting with. You do what you need to do to prepare. Cade shook his hand, feeling something like hope stir in his chest for the first time in weeks. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This thing goes sideways, we could both end up dead or worse. There's nothing worse than dead on the frontier. Cole laughed, sharp and short. Shows how much you know, son. Shows how much you know. The ride back to the ranch took them through country that was coming alive with spring. Wildflowers dotted the grassland in patches of yellow and purple, and the creeks ran high with snowmelt from the mountains. It was beautiful in the way that Montana was always beautiful, indifferent to human suffering, magnificent in its cruelty. Over the next 3 days, Cole called in favors from contacts throughout the territory. Information came back in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that only made sense when you stepped back far enough to see the whole picture. Rylan had been meeting with a man named Carson Briggs, a cattleman from Wyoming with a reputation for sharp deals and sharper practices. Briggs was known to work with hired guns when he needed muscle, and rumor had it he was looking to expand his operation into Montana territory. There were reports of strange riders passing through the valley, men who didn't work for any of the established ranches and didn't seem interested in finding honest work. They kept to themselves, paid in cash, and asked too many questions about the Voss spread and its spring drive schedule. And then there was the most damning piece of information. Rylan had been seen in a telegraph office 2 towns over, sending messages to destinations unknown and paying extra to keep them confidential. Cole laid it all out on his desk one evening, the telegrams and witness statements creating a pattern that was impossible to ignore. "He's planning to steal the herd," Cole said flatly. "During the drive, he'll wait until they're far enough from the home ranch that it'll take days to get help. Then his hired guns will move in. They'll take the cattle, sell them fast to Briggs or someone like him, and Rylan will pocket the money and disappear." Cade felt sick. "Gideon will lose everything. Worse, he'll be ruined. A loss like that doesn't just cost money, it costs reputation, credit, future business. The ranch would have to be sold, probably at a fraction of its value." Cole leaned back in his chair. "And if anyone tries to stop them during the drive, people will die, probably including Gideon himself. We have to warn him." "With what proof? Everything we have is circumstantial. Rylan could talk his way out of all of it, say he was just exploring business opportunities or some such." Cole's expression was grave. "No. If we're going to stop this, we need to catch them in the act. That means going on the drive." "It does." Cade stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "Gideon won't want me there. He made it clear I wasn't welcome." "Then we'll have to change his mind, or work around him." Cole joined him at the window. "I've got connections with the territorial marshal. I can get a deputy assigned to ride with the drive, keep an eye on things. But we'll need someone on the inside, someone who knows the terrain and the players." "Me." "You." "Gideon will never agree to it." Cole smiled, thin and hard. "Good thing we're not going to ask him." The plan came together over the next 2 weeks with the kind of careful precision that spoke to Cole's years of experience handling difficult situations. He sent telegrams to the territorial marshal, explaining the situation and requesting assistance. The marshal, who'd dealt with cattle theft rings before, agreed to send a deputy undercover as a hired hand. Meanwhile, Cade prepared. He cleaned his weapons, checked his gear, and spent long hours thinking through every possible way the ambush could play out. He knew the drive route, had ridden it 6 times during his years with Gideon, knew the dangerous passes, the river crossings, the isolated stretches where help would be hours away. If Rylan was going to make his move, it would be at Dead Horse Canyon, a narrow passage through broken country where the herd would have to string out single file. Perfect terrain for an ambush, perfect place to steal cattle without witnesses. The night before they were set to leave, Tom Wardle appeared at the Cole Ranch. He was dusty and tired, having ridden hard to get there, and his expression was troubled. "Thought you should know," he said without preamble. "The drive starts in 3 days. Gideon's taking a crew of 15 men and moving close to 800 head to the railhead." "Who's going?" Cade asked. "Me, Billy Patterson, most of the regular hands, and Rylan." Tom's jaw tightened. "Gideon insisted. Said it was time his son learned what real work looked like." "Does Gideon suspect anything?" "If he does, he's not sane. But he's been different since you left. Quieter. Like something's bothering him, but he can't put his finger on what." Cole spoke up. "We're going to be there. Not openly, but we'll be there." Tom looked at Cade, something complicated passing across his weathered face. "You're coming back." "I never wanted to leave." "I know, and for what it's worth, I think Gideon knows it too. He's just too proud to admit he made a mistake." Tom pulled an envelope from his coat. Elena asked me to give you this. She's staying with her sister until after the drive. Says she can't watch what's about to happen. Cade took the envelope, recognizing Elena's careful handwriting on the outside. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few words. Be careful. He deserves the truth, even if he can't see it yet. There's something else, Tom said, his voice dropping lower. Mara Quinn's brothers have been asking questions again. They rode through the valley last week, stopped at every ranch and homestead between here and the mountains. They're not going to let this go, Cade. I know. They find out about Rylan, there'll be blood. There'll be blood anyway. Cade folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. Question is whose? Tom left before dawn the next morning, riding back to the Voss spread with promises to keep his eyes open and his mouth shut. Cade watched him go and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. For 3 weeks, he'd been free of it. Now it was back, heavier than ever. Cole found him in the barn, checking his saddle for the 3rd time. Getting nervous? Getting ready. Good. Because I heard from the marshal. His deputy will meet us at the crossroads tomorrow night. Name's Jack Crawford. Ex-ranger, good man in a fight, knows how to keep his head when things go bad. Will one deputy be enough? Depends on how many guns Rylan's hired, but we won't be alone. I'm bringing 2 of my own men, both former cavalry, both solid. Cole's expression was serious. This goes wrong. We could all end up dead. You sure you want to do this? Cade thought about Gideon, who'd given him a chance when he had nothing. About Elena, trapped in a marriage built on lies. About Mara and her baby, innocent casualties of a man's cowardice. About all the good people who depended on the Voss ranch for their livelihood, who'd lose everything if Rylan's plan succeeded. I'm sure. The ride to the rendezvous point took them through familiar country, and every mile brought back memories Cade had been trying to forget. He saw the ridge where he'd first learned to track cattle, the creek where he'd broken his arm falling off a green horse, the valley where he'd watched the sunset with Gideon after a particularly hard day, and felt for the first time in his life like he belonged somewhere. They met Crawford at dusk, in a stand of cottonwoods beside a creek that ran cold and clear. The deputy was younger than Cade expected, maybe 30, with steady eyes and the kind of careful movements that spoke to military training. The 2 Cole men, Davies and Mitchell, were cut from similar cloth, lean and watchful and comfortable with violence when it was necessary. Crawford laid out his understanding of the situation while they made camp. Cole says you think there's going to be an attempt to steal the herd during the drive. Not think. No. Cade sketched out the route in the dirt with a stick. They'll hit us here, at Dead Horse Canyon. It's the only place that makes tactical sense. How many guns you expect? At least 6, maybe more. Rylan's got money and he's desperate. He'll bring as many as he can afford. Crawford nodded slowly. And your role is what, exactly? I'm going to be with the drive. I'll keep Gideon alive and try to minimize casualties when it goes bad. Just like that? Ride up and join a drive you were fired from? Cade met his eyes. Gideon trusted me for 8 years. Deep down, he still does. He'll let me ride. You're betting a lot on that trust. I'm betting everything on it. They finalized the plan over the next few hours. Cade would approach the drive openly, offering his services and hoping Gideon's pride had cooled enough to accept help. Crawford and the others would shadow the drive at a distance, staying close enough to respond when trouble came but far enough away to avoid detection. When the ambush came, and it would come, Cade would try to get Gideon to cover. Crawford and his men would move in from the flanks, catching the attackers in a crossfire. If everything went right, they'd stop the theft and capture enough of the hired guns to prove Rylan's involvement. If everything went wrong, a lot of good men would die in that canyon. That night, Cade lay in his bedroll and stared at the stars, thinking about all the choices that had led him to this moment. He could have told the truth from the beginning, could have let Rylan face the consequences of his actions years ago. But he'd chosen loyalty instead, and now that loyalty had twisted into something dark and dangerous. Tomorrow would be the reckoning. For Rylan, for himself, for everyone who'd been caught in the web of lies that had grown from one man's weakness and another man's misplaced honor. Cade closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing it wouldn't come easy. In the distance, a coyote called, lonely and persistent. The sound echoed across the empty land, a reminder that on the frontier, every man faced his judgment alone. The drive was already 2 days out when Cade caught up to it. He crested a rise and saw the herd spread out below, 800 head of cattle moving like a slow river across the grassland, flanked by riders who looked small against the vastness of the landscape. His chest tightened at the sight. This had been his life for 8 years. These were his people, his work, his home. He rode down the slope slowly, deliberately, giving them plenty of time to see him coming. The first rider to spot him was Billy Patterson, who wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward the main group. Moments later, Tom appeared, riding out to meet him. "You've got nerve," Tom said, but there was something like relief in his eyes. "Or you've lost your mind. Maybe both." "Probably both." Cade nodded toward the herd. "How's it going?" "Smooth so far. Too smooth if you ask me. Ryland's been on his best behavior, actually working for once. It's making everyone nervous." "Where's Gideon?" "Point position, like always." Tom's expression turned serious. "He's going to see you eventually. What's your plan?" "Tell him the truth. All of it." "You think he'll listen?" "I think he doesn't have a choice." They rode together toward the front of the herd, and Cade could feel eyes on him from every direction. The hands were watching, curious and cautious, wondering what his presence meant. As they approached the point, Gideon turned in his saddle, his weathered face hardening when he recognized Cade. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Saving your life," Cade said simply. "And your ranch." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "I told you to leave." "You did, and I did. But circumstances have changed." Cade glanced around, making sure no one else was close enough to hear. "We need to talk, privately. I've got nothing to say to you." "Then just listen." Cade held his gaze, refusing to back down. "Please." Something in Gideon's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, at hearing Cade say please. After a long moment, he nodded curtly. "Tom, take point. Cade, ride with me." They moved away from the herd far enough that their voices wouldn't carry. The sun was high and hot, and the smell of dust and cattle hung thick in the air. Gideon pulled up beside a rocky outcrop and dismounted, his movements stiff with age and suspicion. "Talk." Cade told him everything. About Rylan and Mara, about the lies and the cover-up, about the hired guns and Carson Briggs, and the plan to steal the herd at Dead Horse Canyon. He laid it all out with the kind of brutal honesty that came from knowing there was no point in holding back anymore. When he finished, Gideon was silent for so long that Cade thought he might not respond at all. The older man stood with his back to him, staring out at the horizon as if the answers he needed might be written in the distant mountains. "You're telling me my son is planning to destroy everything I've built?" "Yes, sir." "And you expect me to believe this based on what? Rumors and suspicion?" "Based on evidence. Telegrams, witness statements, patterns of behavior. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't certain." Gideon turned then, and Cade was shocked to see how old he looked. The pride and strength that had always defined him seemed diminished somehow, worn down by the weight of truths he'd been refusing to see. "The baby," Gideon said quietly. "Mara Quinn's baby. It's Ryland's." "Yes, sir." "And you let everyone think it was yours." "I did." "Why?" "Because I was loyal to the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Because I thought I could protect him from himself. Because I was a fool." Cade's voice roughened. "I know you have every reason not to trust me, but I'm asking you to trust me now because if I'm right, we've got maybe a day before everything falls apart." Gideon looked at him for a long time, and Cade could see the war happening behind those hard eyes. This was a man who'd built his life on certainty, on knowing who he could trust and who he couldn't. Now everything he thought he knew was crumbling. "If you're lying to me, I'm not. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong." Cade stepped closer. "Let me prove it. Let me ride with you to Dead Horse Canyon. If nothing happens, you can fire me again and I'll go. But if I'm right, you'll need every gun you can get." The silence stretched out, heavy with possibility and danger. Finally, Gideon nodded, a single sharp movement. "You ride drag. You stay away from Rylan. And if this turns out to be some scheme to get your job back, I'll kill you myself." "Understood." They rode back to the herd together, and Cade could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Word would spread fast. Cade Mercer was back, riding with the drive despite everything that had happened. Some of the hands would be glad. Others would be suspicious. All of them would be watching. Rylan was waiting when they returned, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with calculation. "Father, what's he doing here?" "He's riding with us," Gideon said flatly. "You have a problem with that?" "I just think that's... I don't care what you think. He rides." Gideon's tone left no room for argument. "Now get back to work." Ryland's gaze flicked to Cade, and something cold passed between them. A recognition of the stakes, the players, the game that was about to reach its final move. Then Ryland smiled, that familiar, easy grin that had charmed so many people for so many years. "Welcome back, Cade. Let's hope you're ready for a long, hard ride." Cade didn't smile back. "I was born ready." The drive continued, the herd moving steadily toward Dead Horse Canyon and the confrontation that waited there like a loaded gun. And Cade rode drag, watching the horizon and counting down the hours until the storm finally broke. The herd reached the mouth of Dead Horse Canyon on the fourth day, just as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western peaks. The canyon walls rose up on either side like broken teeth, red stone streaked with black, where water had carved its path over centuries. It was narrow here, barely wide enough for 10 cattle to walk abreast, and it stretched for nearly 3 miles before opening up into the valley beyond. Cade sat his horse at the rear of the column, watching the cattle funnel into the passage with growing tension coiling in his gut. This was it. This was where Rylan would make his move, where hired guns would be waiting in the rocks above, where everything Cade had predicted would either prove true or mark him as a paranoid fool. Tom rode back to join him, his weathered face tight with the same unease Cade felt. "Don't like this," Tom said quietly. "Too many places to hide up there. Too many angles we can't cover." "I know." "You see anything yet?" "No, but they're up there. I can feel it." Tom's hand drifted to the rifle slung across his saddle. "Gideon's riding point with Billy and Harper. Ryland's supposed to be on the left flank, but I lost sight of him about 20 minutes ago." Cade's jaw tightened. "Where?" "Back near that stand of cottonwoods, maybe half a mile behind us. Said he needed to check on a stray." "Alone?" "He insisted." That was it then. Rylan had separated himself from the group, positioning himself away from the danger he knew was coming. Cade scanned the canyon walls, looking for any sign of Crawford and his men. They were supposed to be shadowing the drive from the high ground, ready to move in when the ambush started. But the rocks gave up nothing, no glint of metal or hint of movement. "Tell Gideon to pick up the pace," Cade said. "Get the herd through this canyon as fast as possible." "That'll spook them. Cattle start running in here, we could have a stampede." "Better a stampede than a massacre." Tom looked at him hard, then nodded and spurred his horse forward. Cade watched him go, then turned his attention back to the canyon walls. The sun was hitting them at an angle now, creating deep shadows in the crevices and outcrops. Perfect cover for men with rifles. Perfect killing ground. The first shot came 10 minutes later. It cracked across the canyon like a whip, echoing off the stone walls and sending the cattle into immediate panic. Cade saw one of the lead steers go down, then heard Tom's voice shouting orders that were drowned out by the sudden thunder of hooves and the bellowing of frightened animals. More shots followed, a ragged volley that came from both sides of the canyon. Cade saw muzzle flashes in the rocks above, counted at least 6 positions, maybe more. The cattle were running now, a mass of terrified muscle and horn that could crush a man as easily as any bullet. Cade kicked his horse forward, pushing through the chaos toward where he'd last seen Gideon. A rider appeared out of the dust to his left. One of the new hands, a kid barely 20 with terror written across his face. "Get to cover," Cade shouted. "Behind that outcrop." The kid nodded and veered off just as another shot rang out. Cade felt the bullet pass close enough to his ear that he could hear its angry whine. He ducked low over his horse's neck and kept riding, his eyes scanning for Gideon through the swirling dust and panicked cattle. He found him near the front of the column, trying to turn the herd back on itself to avoid the worst of the stampede. Billy Patterson was beside him, firing his rifle up at the rocks with methodical precision. The young hand's face was set in grim determination, all the boyishness burned away by the reality of men trying to kill him. "Gideon!" Cade pulled up beside them, his horse dancing sideways as cattle surged past. We need to fall back. Like hell! Gideon's face was granite, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. I'm not giving up my herd. They're not after the herd anymore. Cade pointed to where masked riders were beginning to appear on the canyon floor, driving cattle ahead of them toward the northern outlet. They're after you. As if to prove his point, a concentrated volley of gunfire erupted from the rocks directly above them. Billy's horse screamed and went down, throwing the young hand hard against the canyon wall. Cade saw him try to rise, saw blood streaming down his face, and then a second shot took him in the shoulder and he went down for good. Gideon started toward him, but Cade grabbed his arm. He's down! You go out there, you die too! I'm not leaving my men! You're no good to them dead! Another shot, this one so close that Cade felt the heat of it pass his face. His horse reared, and for a moment he was fighting to stay in the saddle while bullets kicked up dirt all around them. Through the chaos, he saw Tom appear from behind a boulder, firing upward with steady aim that spoke to years of frontier survival. Then the world exploded with a different sound. The deep boom of rifle fire coming from above but behind the ambushers. Crawford and his men had arrived, their shots precise and devastating from their elevated positions. Cade saw one of the masked riders in the rocks above throw up his hands and tumble forward, falling 30 feet to land in a broken heap among the cattle. The ambush was suddenly a crossfire, the hunters becoming the hunted. Cade took advantage of the confusion to push Gideon's horse toward a narrow cleft in the canyon wall, a defensive position that would give them some protection. "Stay here!" he shouted. "Crawford's got them pinned!" But Gideon wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on something further up the canyon, and when Cade followed his gaze, he saw what had captured the old man's attention. Rylan had appeared on the canyon floor, but he wasn't running from the fight. He was riding toward it, toward a group of 4 masked riders who'd broken away from the main ambush. Even from a distance, Cade could see the way they moved together, coordinated, like men who knew each other well. "No," Gideon breathed. "No, it can't be." But it was. Rylan pulled up beside the riders, gesturing urgently toward something Cade couldn't see. One of the masked men pointed back toward where Gideon and Cade were positioned, and Rylan nodded. The gesture was small, subtle, but its meaning was unmistakable. He was directing them, telling them where to find his father. Gideon made a sound like a wounded animal, something between a roar and a sob. Before Cade could stop him, the old man spurred his horse forward, charging directly toward his son with his rifle raised. "Gideon, no!" Cade went after him, but the old rancher had a head start and rage driving him like a whip. The masked riders saw him coming and raised their weapons, but Gideon was firing before they could get a clear shot, his bullet striking with the accuracy of a man who'd been shooting since he could walk. 2 of the riders went down. The third took a hit to his arm and wheeled his horse away. But the fourth, a big man on a gray horse, managed to get off a shot that caught Gideon's mount in the chest. The horse went down hard, throwing Gideon clear but leaving him exposed on the canyon floor. Rylan just sat there on his horse, watching. Not helping, not fleeing, just watching as his father struggled to his feet with his rifle clutched in bloodied hands. Cade reached them seconds later, sliding from his saddle and putting himself between Gideon and the remaining gunmen. The big man on the gray horse was lining up another shot when Crawford appeared on the rocks above and put a bullet through his shoulder. The man dropped his rifle and clutched at the wound, cursing viciously. All around them, the ambush was falling apart. Crawford's men had superior position and were making the hired guns pay for every shot they took. The cattle were scattering in all directions, but the men who'd come to steal them were either dead, wounded, or running. And through it all, Rylan sat frozen on his horse, his face pale and his eyes locked on his father's. Gideon limped toward him, his leg injured from the fall, but his fury keeping him upright. When he was close enough, he raised his rifle and pointed it directly at his son's chest. "Get down." Rylan didn't move. "Father, I can explain. Get down." The command carried such weight, such absolute authority, that even Rylan's charm couldn't deflect it. He dismounted slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that came too late to mean anything. "It's not what it looks like," Rylan said, his voice carrying that familiar note of easy confidence even now. "These men, they approached me, said they wanted to buy cattle. I was trying to negotiate." "Shut your mouth." Gideon's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through Rylan's excuses like a knife. "I watched you point them toward me. Watched you tell them where to shoot." "That's not..." I said shut your mouth. Gideon took a step closer, and Cade saw tears streaming down the old man's weathered face. You're my son, my blood. I gave you everything, and you tried to kill me for it. Ryland's composure finally cracked. You gave me nothing but expectations I could never meet and disappointment every time I failed. You loved this ranch more than you ever loved me. So you decided to destroy it? To destroy everything I built? Gideon's voice broke. To kill the men who trusted me, who depend on this place for their lives? I needed the money, the debts, the gambling, Elena threatening to leave. I needed a way out. Ryland's face twisted with desperation. And Briggs offered me one. A clean break, a fresh start, enough money to disappear and start over somewhere else. And Mara Quinn? Cade spoke for the first time, his voice cold. Where did she fit into your fresh start? Ryland's eyes flicked to him, something ugly crossing his features. That was a mistake. One night, nothing more. She knew what she was getting into. She knew you'd abandon her? Knew you'd let another man take the blame while her child grew up fatherless? What did you expect me to do? Acknowledge a bastard? Destroy my marriage and my father's opinion of me for a woman I barely knew? The words hung in the air, damning in their casual cruelty. Cade saw Gideon's face go from grief to something harder, something final. You're not my son anymore, Gideon said quietly. You're a stranger wearing my son's face. Father, please. The sound of hooves interrupted them. Tom appeared, leading several of the hands who'd survived the ambush. Behind them, Crawford and his men were climbing down from the rocks, their rifles still ready, but the immediate danger past. Crawford surveyed the scene with professional detachment, taking in the dead and wounded gunmen, the scattered cattle, and Ryland standing there with his father's rifle pointed at his chest. You Ryland Voss? Crawford asked. Who's asking? Crawford pulled back his coat to reveal his deputy's badge. Territorial Marshal's Office. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit cattle theft, attempted murder, and whatever else I can think of by the time we get to town. Ryland's face went white. You can't prove anything. Don't need to prove much. Got 5 witnesses who saw you directing gunmen toward your father. Got written statements from 2 of Briggs's men who turned on him in exchange for lighter sentences. Got telegrams in your handwriting arranging the whole thing. Crawford gestured to his men. Take him. As they moved to restrain Ryland, he turned desperately to his father. Please, don't let them do this. I'm your son, your blood. That has to mean something. Gideon looked at him for a long moment, and Cade saw something die in the old man's eyes. The hope, maybe. The belief that love and patience could redeem someone who didn't want to be redeemed. It means I raised a coward, Gideon said flatly, and that's a shame I'll carry to my grave. He turned and walked away, limping heavily, leaving Ryland standing there with Crawford's men closing in around him. The young man's face crumpled, all the charm and confidence finally stripped away to reveal the hollow thing beneath. As they led Ryland away, Cade moved to check on the wounded. Billy Patterson was alive but in bad shape, his shoulder bleeding heavily and his face pale with shock. 3 other hands had taken hits, though none as serious. 2 of the hired gunmen were dead, 3 more wounded badly enough that they wouldn't be going anywhere. And everywhere, scattered across miles of canyon floor, were Gideon's cattle. The herd he'd spent years building, now scattered to the wind by his own son's greed. Tom appeared beside Cade, his face grim. Harper's dead, took a bullet in the first volley, never had a chance. Cade closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Harper had been a good man, steady and reliable, with a wife and 2 children waiting for him back in the valley. Now they'd be waiting forever. Anyone else? Jenkins took one in the leg, but he'll make it. The kid, Patterson, he needs a doctor fast or he's not going to see tomorrow. Tom looked around at the carnage. This is bad, Cade, real bad. I know. Gideon's not going to survive this. Losing his son, losing Harper, the scandal when this gets out. Tom shook his head. This'll break him. Cade looked to where Gideon stood alone near the canyon wall, staring at nothing. The old man seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour, his shoulders bowed under a weight no amount of frontier toughness could carry. Maybe, Cade said quietly, or maybe it'll forge him into something stronger. Crawford joined them, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. Hell of a day. That's one way to put it. Cade gestured to the scattered herd. We need to round up as many of those cattle as we can before dark, and we need to get the wounded back to town. I'll take the prisoners and the worst wounded back first thing in the morning. You think you can handle the herd? We'll manage. It's what we do. Crawford studied him for a moment. Gideon's lucky to have you. He fired me, remember? He was wrong, and if he's got any sense left, he knows it. Wood, Crawford clapped him on the shoulder. I'll make sure Rylan and his friends face justice. You make sure the old man doesn't fall apart. As Crawford walked away to organize his prisoners, Cade moved toward Gideon. The old rancher didn't acknowledge his approach, didn't turn or speak. He just stood there, staring at the canyon walls as if they held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Sir, Cade said quietly. Gideon's voice, when it came, was hollow. I should have seen it. All these years, all the signs. I should have known what he was. You saw what you wanted to see. What any father would want to see. And it nearly cost me everything. Gideon finally turned to look at him, and Cade was shocked by the devastation in those hard eyes. He was going to kill me. My own son was going to murder me for money. I know. And you tried to warn me. You told me the truth, and I didn't want to hear it. Gideon's jaw worked, emotions warring across his face. I fired you for being loyal, for trying to protect people who deserved protecting instead of the one person who didn't. You didn't know. I knew. The words came out sharp, bitter. Deep down, I knew. I just didn't want to admit it. Didn't want to face the fact that my son was weak and selfish and cruel. So I blamed you instead. Let you carry the weight of his sins while I pretended everything was fine. Cade didn't know what to say to that. There was no comfort that would land, no words that could undo the damage or ease the grief of a father who'd just lost his son to his son's own choices. Harper's dead, Gideon said quietly. Good man, family man. Dead because my son wanted money more than he wanted honor. Harper knew the risks. We all did. That doesn't make it right. Gideon looked around at the scattered cattle, the wounded men, the bodies of hired guns lying broken on the canyon floor. None of this is right. They stood in silence for a moment, two men surrounded by the wreckage of choices and consequences. Finally, Gideon straightened, something shifting in his posture as he pushed the grief aside and found the steel beneath. We need to round up the herd, get the wounded to safety, deal with the dead. His voice was rough but steady. Can you help me do that? Yes, sir. And after we get through this, Gideon paused, seeming to search for words. I'd like you to come back to the ranch, as foreman, if you'll have it. Cade met his eyes, saw the apology there, the regret, and the hope. I'll have it. Gideon nodded, just once, then turned and started barking orders to the surviving hands. The old rancher was wounded, grieving, and facing a scandal that would echo through the territory for years. But he was still standing, still fighting, still doing the work that needed to be done. Cade mounted his horse and rode out to start gathering the scattered herd, Tom and the others falling in beside him. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold. Beautiful and indifferent, the way the frontier always was. By the time full dark fell, they'd managed to gather maybe half the herd into a makeshift corral formed by rope and canyon walls. The other half would take days to find, scattered across miles of broken country. But it was a start. Crawford left at first light with Rylan and the surviving gunmen in chains, along with Billy Patterson and the other wounded who needed immediate medical attention. Rylan didn't look back as they rode away, didn't try to speak to his father one last time. He just stared straight ahead, his face blank, already becoming the stranger Gideon had named him. The rest of them spent 3 more days in that canyon, hunting down cattle and dealing with the aftermath. They buried Harper on a hill overlooking the valley, marking his grave with a cairn of stones that would weather 100 Montana winters. Tom said a few words, simple and honest, about a man who'd done his work well and died defending something that mattered. Gideon stood through it all with his hat in his hands and his face carved from granite, and when it was over, he placed his hat back on his head and got back to work. On the 4th day, they finally pushed what remained of the herd out of the canyon and onto open ground. 600 head, maybe a few more, down from the 800 they'd started with. It was a loss, but not a catastrophic one. The ranch would survive. Whether Gideon would survive in the same way remained to be seen. They made camp that night beside a creek, and after the evening meal, Gideon called Cade over to where he sat by the fire. "Sit." Cade sat, accepting the cup of coffee Gideon poured for him. They drank in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and the soft lowing of cattle settling down for sleep. "I need to know something," Gideon said finally. "The Quinn woman, Mara. How bad is it for her?" "Bad. She's alone on that homestead with a baby and winter coming on. Her brothers are protective, but they're not much for farming. Without help, she won't make it through." "And the child is Ryland's." It wasn't a question, but Cade answered anyway. "Yes, sir." Gideon was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "That makes the boy my grandson." "Yes, sir." "I have a responsibility to him then, to both of them." Gideon's voice was heavy with resignation. "Even if acknowledging that responsibility means acknowledging what my son did. The territory is going to know soon enough anyway. Crawford's report will make it all public." "I know." Gideon drained his coffee and set the cup aside. "When we get back, I want you to ride out to the Quinn place. Tell Mara that I'll provide for the child. Money, land, whatever she needs. The boy's a Voss, whether his father wanted to claim him or not. She might not accept it. Then make her understand that this isn't charity. It's duty. Blood matters, even when the blood comes from someone who didn't deserve to pass it on." Gideon looked at Cade directly. "And tell her I'm sorry for what my son did, for what you had to endure because of it, for all of it." Cade nodded, his throat tight. "I will. There's something else." Gideon hesitated, then pushed forward. "Elena, my daughter-in-law, she's going to need help too. The marriage is over, obviously, but she shouldn't be punished for Ryland's crimes. She's staying with her sister, last I heard. I'll make sure she has options, an annulment, money to start over, whatever she needs." Gideon's face hardened. "My son destroyed enough lives. I won't let his mess destroy any more." They sat together until the fire burned down to embers, two men trying to figure out how to rebuild something that had been shattered beyond recognition. Around them, the other hands were settling in for the night, exhausted but alive, grateful for small mercies in a land that offered precious few. The drive continued the next morning, slower now, without Harper's steady hand, and with the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. But they kept moving, kept working, kept pushing the herd toward the railhead because that was what you did on the frontier. You endured. You survived. You kept going even when everything in you wanted to stop. 5 days later, they reached the railhead town, sold the cattle for less than they would have gotten with the full herd, but still enough to keep the ranch solvent. Gideon handled the business transactions with his usual grim efficiency, then paid each of the hands their wages plus a bonus for everything they'd endured. When it was Cade's turn, Gideon handed him an envelope that was heavier than expected. "Your back pay plus what you would have earned if I hadn't been a stubborn fool." Gideon's voice was gruff. "And a share of the sale because you earned it." "Sir, I can't." "You can and you will. You saved my life, saved the ranch, saved what little honor the Voss name has left." Gideon held out his hand. "Welcome back, Foreman." Cade shook it, feeling the strength still in that weathered grip. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We've got hard times ahead. The scandal, the losses, rebuilding trust with people who are going to look at the Voss name and see shame." But to Gideon's expression was bleak but determined. "But we'll get through it. One day at a time, one choice at a time. The way everything worthwhile gets done." They rode back to the ranch together, Cade and Gideon at the front, Tom and the others following behind. The valley opened up before them as they crested the final rise, the ranch building small and solid against the vast backdrop of mountains and sky. It looked the same as it always had, but everything had changed. And as Cade rode down into that valley, he knew that the hardest work was still ahead, rebuilding trust, healing wounds, proving that the Voss ranch could survive the sins of Gideon's son and emerge stronger on the other side. The sun was setting as they reached the ranch yard, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Cade dismounted and unsaddled his horse, moving through the familiar motions with muscle memory earned over 8 years of doing the same work in the same place. This was home. Not because it was easy or comfortable or perfect, but because it was where he'd chosen to stand, where he'd chosen to fight, where he'd finally chosen truth over loyalty and found something worth more than either. Tomorrow, he would ride out to see Mara Quinn, to deliver Gideon's message and start the process of making right what Rylan had made wrong. Tomorrow, the real work of rebuilding would begin. But tonight, he was home, and that was enough. Morning came with frost on the grass and a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Cade saddled his horse while the rest of the ranch was still waking up, the envelope from Gideon tucked securely in his coat pocket along with the second envelope, this one containing a letter the old man had written the night before. Cade hadn't read it, hadn't asked what it said. Some things were between Gideon and the woman his son had wronged, and Cade was just the messenger. The ride to the Quinn homestead took him through country that was coming alive with late spring. Wildflowers dotted the grassland in patches of color, and the creeks ran clear and cold with the last of the mountain snowmelt. It was beautiful in a way that made a man's chest ache, the kind of beauty that reminded him why people came to this hard land and stayed despite everything it threw at them. He approached the cabin the same way he had before, slowly, visibly, giving plenty of warning, but this time it was Declan Quinn who stepped out with the rifle, his face hard and his stance aggressive. "You've got nerve showing your face here again." Cade reined in his horse and kept his hands where Declan could see them. "I need to speak with your sister. It's important." "Important." Declan spat the word like a curse. "What's important is you staying away from her. We heard about what happened at Dead Horse Canyon. Heard Rylan Voss got arrested for trying to kill his own father. That's true. Also heard you were the one who stopped him, that you've been working to bring him down this whole time." Declan's eyes narrowed. "So which is it, Mercer? Are you the hero or the coward who let my sister take the fall?" "I'm the man who made mistakes and is trying to fix them." Mara appeared in the doorway before Declan could respond, the baby in her arms and her expression unreadable. "Let him speak, Dec." "Mara," I said, "let him speak." Her voice carried authority that surprised even her brother. "I want to hear what he has to say." Declan stepped aside reluctantly, and Cade dismounted, approaching the cabin with careful respect. Mara looked different than she had a month ago, stronger somehow, as if the weight she'd been carrying had settled into something she could manage rather than something that was crushing her. "Mr. Mercer," she said formally, "you have news?" "I do. Can we talk inside?" She studied him for a moment, then nodded and stepped back. The cabin was warmer than last time, better provisioned. Cade noticed fresh supplies stacked in the corner: flour, coffee, salt pork, blankets. Tom had kept his word. Mara settled the baby in his cradle, then turned to face Cade with her arms crossed. "Well?" Cade pulled out both envelopes and held them out. "The first is from me. Money I owe you for the suffering my silence caused. The second is from Gideon Voss. He asked me to deliver it personally and to tell you that he intends to provide for his grandson." Mara didn't take the envelopes immediately. "His grandson. Samuel is Rylan's son. That makes him Gideon's blood. Whether Rylan wanted to acknowledge it or not." Cade's voice was steady. "Gideon's a hard man, but he's a fair one. He knows what his son did to you was wrong, and he wants to make it right." "Make it right?" Mara's laugh was bitter. "How do you make right the fact that my child will grow up knowing his father is a criminal? That the whole territory knows his mother was abandoned and disgraced? You can't. But you can make sure he has what he needs to survive. Land, money, a future that doesn't depend on charity or luck." Cade set the envelopes on the table. "Gideon's offering you a piece of the ranch. Good land, with water and timber. Enough to build a real homestead, one that will support you and Samuel through whatever comes." Mara stared at the envelopes as if they might bite her. "And what does he want in return?" "Nothing. Just the knowledge that he did right by his grandson when his son wouldn't." "I don't want his money. It's not about what you want. It's about what Samuel needs." Cade's voice gentled. "You're strong, Mara. Stronger than most people I've met. But even the strongest person can't do this alone. Not out here, not with a child depending on you." Finn appeared in the doorway, having been listening from outside. "She's got us. We take care of our own." "I know you do, but you're also running a homestead barely big enough to support 2 grown men, let alone a woman and a baby." Cade looked between the brothers. "Gideon's offering you all a better chance. Take it." Declan moved into the cabin, his expression still hostile, but less certain. "And what's your angle in all this, Mercer? Why do you care what happens to us?" "Because I should have told the truth from the beginning, because I let you believe I was the father, and let your sister face the consequences of another man's cowardice." Cade met his eyes squarely. "I can't undo that, but I can try to make sure it doesn't destroy her future." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and suspicion. Finally, Mara reached out and picked up Gideon's envelope, breaking the seal with careful fingers. She read the letter inside while her brothers watched, her expression shifting from wariness to something like disbelief. "He's offering us 200 acres, she said quietly, "adjacent to the main ranch with grazing rights and water access, and money to build a proper house and barn." "That's prime land," Finn said, his voice tight with surprise. "Worth a small fortune." "He also says," Mara's voice caught, "he says that Samuel is welcome at the ranch house whenever I choose to bring him, that he wants to know his grandson, if I'll allow it." She looked up at Cade, tears shining in her eyes. "Why would he do this, after what his son did?" "Because he's trying to be the man Rylan never was. Because he knows that blood carries responsibility, and he's not going to shirk it just because his son did." Cade gestured to the envelope he'd brought. "My money is there too. It's not much, but it's yours if you'll take it." Mara set Gideon's letter down and picked up the second envelope, weighing it in her hands. "I don't want your guilt money, Mr. Mercer." "It's not guilt money. It's an apology, and a promise that from now on, if you need help, all you have to do is ask." She opened the envelope and stared at the bills inside. More money than Cade had saved in 2 years of hard work. Enough to make a real difference to buy livestock or equipment, or simply to have a cushion against the kind of disasters that could destroy a frontier family in a single season. "This is too much," she whispered. "It's not enough. Nothing could be enough for what you went through. But it's what I have to give." Mara closed the envelope and held it against her chest, her face working through a complicated series of emotions. Finally, she looked at her brothers. "What do you think?" Declan was quiet for a long moment. "I think we'd be fools to turn down land like that. I think Gideon Voss is trying to do right by you in a way his son never did, and I think—" He looked at Cade with grudging respect. "I think Mercer here has been carrying a weight that wasn't his to carry, and he's trying to put it down in the only way he knows how." Finn nodded slowly. "The land would give us a real chance. Space to grow, resources to build something that lasts. And Samuel would have opportunities we could never give him on this rock pile." Mara walked to the cradle and looked down at her sleeping son. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Then we'll accept, for Samuel's sake. But, Mr. Mercer, I want you to understand something." "What's that?" "This doesn't erase what happened, doesn't make the scandal go away or give my son back the father he should have had. But it's a start, and sometimes a start is all we get." "I know, and I'm grateful you're giving us the chance to try." She turned and extended her hand formally. "Then tell Gideon Voss we accept his offer, and tell him that when the time is right, he's welcome to meet his grandson." Cade shook her hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "I'll tell him, and Mara, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We've still got to survive the gossip and the judgment and all the people who are going to have opinions about this." She managed a small smile. "But we're tougher than we look." "I never doubted it." Cade left the Quinn homestead with the morning sun climbing higher and the certainty that at least one piece of the broken puzzle was being put back together. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was progress. And on the frontier, progress was sometimes the best you could hope for. The ride back to the Voss ranch took him past the general store in town, and on impulse, Cade stopped. The talk would be thick here, he knew. The whole territory would have heard about Dead Horse Canyon by now, about Ryland's arrest and Gideon's loss, and the scandal that touched everyone involved. Inside, the store went quiet when he entered. Mrs. Patterson was behind the counter, Billy's mother, her face tight with the grief of a son still recovering from his wounds. Other townspeople were scattered through the aisles, their conversations dying as they watched Cade with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He walked to the counter and met Mrs. Patterson's eyes directly. "Ma'am, I heard Billy's back from the doctor. How's he doing?" Her expression softened slightly. "He'll live." Lost the use of his right arm, but the doctor says he'll regain most of it with time. She paused. Tom Wardell told me what happened. Said my Billy would have died if you hadn't been there to help get him to cover. Billy's a good hand, brave when it counted. He also told me the truth about the rest of it, about Rylan Voss and that poor Quinn girl. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped lower, about how you let people think the worst of you to protect that boy, and how he repaid you by trying to kill his own father. Around them, Cade could feel the attention of everyone in the store focused on their conversation. This was how news spread on the frontier, one conversation at a time, one witness passing judgment to the next. It's more complicated than that, Cade said quietly. Is it? Because from where I stand, it looks pretty simple. You're a good man who made a mistake protecting someone who didn't deserve protection, and now everyone knows it. She reached across the counter and patted his hand awkwardly. We were wrong about you, Mr. Mercer. The whole town was wrong, and I'm sorry for it. There's nothing to be sorry for. There's plenty, but words are cheap. She straightened and raised her voice slightly, addressing the store at large. If anyone wants to keep spreading gossip about Cade Mercer being responsible for Mara Quinn's situation, they can take their business elsewhere. This store serves truth-tellers and honest workers, not liars and cowards. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Several people looked away, shamefaced. Others nodded in agreement. And slowly, conversation resumed, though the tone had shifted from judgment to something more like grudging respect. Cade bought coffee and ammunition, paid his bill, and left before the attention could become uncomfortable. But as he rode away from town, he felt another weight lifting. The court of public opinion was fickle and harsh, but it could also be surprisingly quick to forgive once the truth came out. Back at the ranch, life was settling into new rhythms. Tom had taken over training the younger hands, while Gideon handled the business of rebuilding trust with buyers and partners who'd heard about the scandal. It was slow work, made slower by pride and the particular kind of shame that came from having your family's failures exposed for everyone to judge. Cade threw himself into the daily work, mending fences, moving cattle, breaking horses that needed breaking. Physical labor had always been his way of processing complicated emotions, and there were plenty of those to work through. A week after his visit to the Quinn homestead, Elena Voss returned to the valley. She came alone, driving a small wagon loaded with her belongings, her face set in an expression of quiet determination. When she pulled up in the ranch yard, Gideon came out to meet her. Cade watched from the barn as the two of them talked, too far away to hear words but close enough to read body language. There was no anger in the exchange, no drama. Just two people who'd both been wounded by the same man's choices, trying to figure out how to move forward. After a few minutes, Gideon gestured toward the ranch house, and Elena shook her head. She said something that made the old man's shoulders sag, then reached out and squeezed his arm before climbing back onto the wagon and driving away. Gideon stood in the yard for a long time after she left, staring at the dust her wagon had kicked up. When he finally moved, it was to walk directly to the barn where Cade was working. She's filing for annulment, Gideon said without preamble. Going back to Wyoming to live with her family. Says she can't stay in a place that reminds her of what she lost. I'm sorry, sir. Don't be. She deserves better than what my son gave her. Better than what this valley can offer her now. Gideon leaned against the stall door, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. She asked me to tell you something, though. What's that? She said to thank you, for trying to warn her, for standing up when it mattered, for being the kind of man her husband should have been. Gideon's voice roughened. She said you gave her the courage to leave because you showed her what real honor looks like. Cade didn't know what to say to that. He just kept working, brushing down the horse with steady strokes while Gideon watched. I got word from Crawford yesterday, Gideon continued. Ryland's trial is set for next month. They've got enough evidence to convict him 3 times over. Conspiracy, attempted murder, cattle theft, the whole mess. He's looking at 20 years in territorial prison, maybe more. How do you feel about that? Gideon was quiet for so long that Cade thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a grief that would never fully heal. I feel like I failed him. Like somewhere along the way, I taught him all the wrong lessons. Made him think that being a Voss meant he was entitled to things he didn't earn, that blood was more important than character. Gideon rubbed his face with work-roughened hands. But I also feel like justice is being done, and maybe that's the only thing that matters now. You didn't fail him, sir. He failed himself. Maybe. But a father's supposed to prepare his son for the world, teach him how to stand on his own and do what's right even when it's hard. I didn't do that. I made excuses for him, covered for him, hoped he'd grow into the man I wanted him to be instead of dealing with the man he was. Gideon's expression was bleak. That's on me, and I'll carry it. Cade set down his brush and turned to face Gideon fully. You can't carry it alone. And you don't have to. You've got good men here who respect you, a ranch that's still standing, and a grandson who deserves to know his grandfather is a man worth knowing. The Quinn boy. Samuel, his name is Samuel. Cade's voice was firm. And Mara's agreed to let you be part of his life, if you're willing to do the work to earn that privilege. Something flickered in Gideon's eyes. Hope, maybe, or just the faint possibility of redemption. She'd let me see him? After everything? She said when the time is right, you're welcome. But you'll have to prove to her that you're different from your son. That blood doesn't automatically mean acceptance. I can do that. I will do that. Gideon straightened, and some of the old strength returned to his posture. That boy will know what it means to be a Voss the right way. Through work and honor and doing right by people, not through entitlement and charm. Then you'd better get started. Mara and her brothers are moving on to that land you gave them next week. They'll need help building, getting settled, learning the territory. I'll make sure they have whatever they need. Gideon held out his hand. And Cade, thank you for everything. For standing up when I was too blind to see. For saving the ranch. For being the kind of man I should have taught my son to be. Cade shook his hand, feeling the firm grip and the unspoken weight of everything that had passed between them. You gave me a chance when I had nothing, sir. I'm just repaying the debt. You've repaid it 100 times over. Now we're building something new, something better than what we had before. Over the following weeks, the ranch transformed in subtle ways. The Quinn family moved onto their new land with help from every hand on the Voss spread and several neighboring ranches. The cabin that went up was solid and well built, with room to grow and windows that faced the mountains. Gideon visited once, briefly, to meet his grandson, a meeting that left the old man shaken but determined. He's got Ryland's eyes, Gideon told Cade later, but Mara's strength. Maybe he'll have a better chance than his father did. He will, because he's got people around him who won't let him fail. The trial came and went with the inevitability of a Montana winter. Ryland was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in territorial prison. The courtroom was packed with spectators, but neither Gideon nor Cade attended. Some things were too painful to witness, even when justice demanded them. Carson Briggs and his hired guns received similar sentences, their operation dismantled and their names added to the long list of men who'd tried to take what wasn't theirs and paid the price. The stolen cattle that had been recovered were returned to their rightful owners, and the territory's marshal made it clear that cattle theft would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. As summer settled over the valley, the Voss Ranch found its rhythm again. The scandal slowly faded into just another story people told about hard times and harder choices. Some still gossiped, but most folks had moved on to newer concerns and fresher dramas. Tom was promoted to assistant foreman, a position he accepted with characteristic gruffness and underlying pride. Billy Patterson recovered enough to return to light work, his right arm weak but functional, his spirit undimmed by the violence he'd survived. The new hands who were hired to replace those lost at Dead Horse Canyon were chosen for character as much as skill. Gideon and Cade both determined never to repeat past mistakes. One evening in late July, Cade was checking fence lines on the southern boundary when he saw a rider approaching. As the figure got closer, he recognized Mara Quinn, sitting her horse with the kind of easy competence that spoke to hours in the saddle. She pulled up beside him and dismounted, her hair pulled back and her face sunbrowned and healthy. Mr. Mercer. Mara, this is a surprise. I was riding the boundary between our land and Gideon's. Thought I'd find you out here somewhere. She looked around at the rolling grassland, the distant mountains, the sky so big it seemed to swallow everything. It's beautiful country. That it is. How's Samuel? Growing like a weed. My brothers are convinced he's going to be the size of a barn by the time he's 5. She smiled, and Cade was struck by how much lighter she seemed. Gideon visits once a week, brings supplies, plays with the baby, doesn't stay too long. It's nice. Awkward sometimes, but nice. He's trying. I know, and I appreciate it more than I thought I would. Mara was quiet for a moment, then looked at him directly. I came to tell you something. What's that? I forgive you. For the lies, for the silence, for letting me face the scandal alone. I know you were caught in an impossible situation, and I know you've worked hard to make it right. She held his gaze. I wanted you to hear that from me directly. No more weight to carry. The words hit Cade harder than any bullet could have. He felt his throat tighten, felt tears prick at his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing, being honest, helping where you can, building something good out of the wreckage Rylan left behind. She remounted her horse with fluid grace. And Cade? Next time you're near our place, stop by. We're having a barn raising next month, and we could use every skilled hand we can get. I'll be there. She rode away toward her new home, and Cade watched her go with something that felt almost like peace settling in his chest. Not complete peace. That might never come. But the kind of peace that came from knowing you'd faced your mistakes and done everything in your power to fix them. That evening, Gideon called a meeting in the ranch house. Every hand on the spread was there, crowded into the main room with hats in hands and expressions ranging from curious to concerned. The old rancher stood before them, his weathered face serious but not grim. I called you all here because you deserve to know where things stand, Gideon began. The ranch took a hit this year. We lost cattle, lost good men, lost reputation. But we survived. And we survived because of men like you, loyal, hardworking, willing to stand when things got dangerous. He paused, looking around at the gathered hands. I made mistakes, trusted the wrong person, overlooked warning signs I should have seen, let pride and hope blind me to truths that needed facing. I can't undo those mistakes, but I can learn from them, and I can make sure this ranch becomes something better because of them. Tom spoke up from the back. What are you saying, boss? I'm saying we're going to do things different from now on. Every hand who works here will be treated with respect and paid fair wages. Every decision about this ranch will be made with input from the men who do the actual work. And if anyone has concerns about how things are being run, my door is open. Gideon's voice strengthened. This place belongs to all of us. Not just because our names are on the deed, but because we bleed for it, sweat for it, build our lives around it. Cade felt something shift in the room, a loosening of tension, a collective exhale. These were men who'd seen their world nearly destroyed by one man's greed and another man's blind faith. Hearing Gideon acknowledge that, own it, and commit to doing better meant everything. There's one more thing, Gideon continued. Effective immediately, Cade Mercer is foreman of this ranch with full authority to make decisions about operations, hiring, and the daily running of things. I trust him completely, and I expect all of you to do the same. He turned to Cade, extending his hand. You've earned this 100 times over. Take it. Cade stood and shook Gideon's hand while the gathered men applauded, the sound filling the ranch house with warmth and approval. It wasn't just a title or a position. It was recognition, acceptance, a statement that he belonged here, not despite everything that had happened, but because of how he'd handled it. After the meeting broke up and the hands dispersed, Gideon pulled Cade aside. Walk with me. They went outside into the cooling evening air, their boots crunching on gravel as they walked toward the corral. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the whole valley glow. I'm getting older, Gideon said without preamble. Not old enough to step aside yet, but old enough to know I won't run this ranch forever. I need to think about what happens when I'm gone. Sir, let me finish. Gideon stopped and turned to face him. I had a son. Lost him to his own choices and his own weakness. But I've been thinking lately that blood isn't the only thing that makes family. Loyalty does. Honor does. Standing up when it matters and doing the right thing even when it costs you everything. Cade felt his heart hammering in his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that when the time comes, and I'm not saying it's coming tomorrow, I want you to run this ranch, not as foreman working for someone else, but as a partner. Maybe even as the owner, if you're willing to take it on. Gideon's expression was serious. You've bled for this place, fought for it, sacrificed for it. You've earned the right to build its future. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. Think about it. This is a big responsibility, and I won't force it on you if you don't want it. Gideon smiled slightly. But I hope you do, because I can't think of anyone I'd trust more to carry the Voss name forward the right way. They stood together in the gathering dusk, two men who'd been through fire and come out scarred but standing. Around them, the ranch settled into evening routines, horses being fed, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft sounds of men finishing their work and preparing for rest. I'll think about it, Cade said finally. And sir, thank you for the trust, for the second chance, for everything. You don't need to thank me for giving you what you already earned. Gideon clapped him on the shoulder. Now get some sleep. We've got fence to mend in the morning, and that won't do itself. Autumn came early that year, with frost appearing on the grass before September ended, and the aspen leaves turning gold against the dark pines. The Quinn family's barn raising happened on a Saturday in late September, with half the valley showing up to help. Cade worked alongside Tom, Billy, and a dozen other hands, raising walls and setting beams, while Mara and her brothers coordinated the effort with practiced efficiency. Gideon arrived late morning with a wagon full of supplies and young Samuel in his arms, the baby bundled against the cold and staring at everything with wide, curious eyes. The sight of the old rancher holding his grandson with such careful tenderness made more than one person turn away with suspiciously bright eyes. By sunset, the barn stood complete, solid and square, with room for livestock and equipment and all the tools a growing homestead would need. The community gathered for a meal of beef and bread and beer, sharing stories and laughter as the stars came out overhead. Cade found himself sitting next to Mara as the evening wound down, both of them tired and satisfied in the way that came from good work completed. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you did today and for everything you've done since that day in my cabin. You already thanked me for that." "I know, but it bears repeating." She looked at Samuel, sleeping peacefully in Gideon's arms across the fire. "My son has a future now, a real one, with land and family and opportunities I could never have given him alone. That's because of you. It's because of a lot of people. Maybe, but it started with you choosing truth over loyalty. That took courage." She met his eyes. "This valley's lucky to have you, Cade Mercer, and I'm lucky to call you a friend. The feeling's mutual." As winter approached, the ranch prepared for the hard months ahead with the kind of methodical efficiency that came from years of frontier survival. Wood was stacked, supplies were laid in, and the cattle were moved to winter pasture where they'd have shelter from the worst of the storms. Crawford stopped by in early November with news that Rylan had been transferred to the territorial prison in Wyoming, where he'd serve out his sentence far from the valley he'd tried to destroy. The deputy looked older, worn down by too many trials and too much frontier justice. "He asked about you," Crawford told Cade over coffee in the bunkhouse. "Wanted to know if you'd visit." "What did you tell him?" "Told him you had better things to do than waste time on a man who'd tried to have you killed." Crawford shrugged. He didn't seem surprised. Probably not. Rylan always knew how to read people, even if he never learned to value them. "You ever regret it? Standing up to him, telling the truth?" Cade thought about that for a long moment. "I regret not doing it sooner, but no, I don't regret the choice itself. Some things are worth losing everything for." Crawford nodded and stood to leave. "Well, the territory's better off with men like you keeping it honest. Don't let anyone tell you different." After he left, Cade sat in the quiet bunkhouse and thought about the year that had passed, about choices and consequences, about loyalty and truth, about the particular kind of strength it took to admit you'd been wrong and work to make it right. He'd lost things this year, his innocence about people he'd trusted, his naive belief that loyalty alone was enough, his certainty about his place in the world. But he'd gained things too, real friendship with men like Tom and Garrett Cole, respect from a community that had judged him harshly and then admitted their mistake. A future that was his to build rather than one he was living in service to someone else's vision. And he'd gained something harder to name, a sense of peace that came from knowing he'd faced the hardest thing a man could face and come through it with his honor intact. The first snow fell in mid-November, blanketing the valley in white and bringing with it the deep quiet that only winter could create. Cade stood in the ranch yard early one morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains and turn the snow to gold and pink and colors that had no names. Gideon joined him, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He passed one to Cade without speaking, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the day begin. "You thought about what I asked?" Gideon said finally. "About the future of the ranch?" "I have." "And?" "I'll do it. When the time comes, I'll take it on. Build it into something that honors what you started but isn't bound by past mistakes." Gideon smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost young. "Good, that's good. We'll work out the details later, put it in writing, make it official. But for now, just knowing you're committed is enough." They drank their coffee and watched the ranch wake up around them. Smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney, horses moving in the corral, the first hands emerging to start their day. It was ordinary and beautiful, the kind of moment that was easy to overlook but impossible to replace. "You know what I've learned this year?" Gideon asked. "What's that?" "That the strongest thing a man can do isn't standing firm when he's right. It's admitting when he's wrong and doing the work to fix it." Gideon's voice was thoughtful. "I spent years thinking strength meant never backing down, never admitting weakness, never showing doubt. But that kind of strength just builds walls. Real strength builds bridges. You're building one now, with Mara and Samuel. Trying to, anyway. It's slow work, earning trust after it's been broken, but it's work worth doing." Gideon finished his coffee and clapped Cade on the shoulder. "Come on, those fences won't mend themselves, and we've got a ranch to run." They walked toward the barn together, ready for another day of the work that never ended but gave meaning to everything else. Behind them, the sun continued its climb, burning away the morning mist and revealing the valley in all its harsh, beautiful glory. This was the frontier. This was Montana. This was home. And for Cade Mercer, who'd spent so many years searching for a place to belong, that simple truth was enough. The past had been painful, full of mistakes and betrayals and hard-learned lessons. But the future stretched out ahead, full of possibility, built on a foundation of truth and honor and the kind of loyalty that was earned rather than demanded. He'd been tested by fire and found himself worthy. Not perfect, not without scars, but worthy nonetheless. And in the end, that was all any man could ask for. The chance to stand in the light of an honest day and know that he'd done his best to live up to the trust others had placed in him. The ranch would endure. The valley would endure. And Cade Mercer, foreman and future owner, would endure alongside them, building, growing, creating something lasting out of the wreckage one man's weakness had left behind. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and snow and the promise of storms to come. But the barn was warm, the work was good, and the men around him were solid and true. Whatever storms came, they would weather them together. And that, Cade had learned, was what really mattered on the frontier, not avoiding the hard times, but having people worth standing with when they arrived. He picked up his tools and got to work. The rhythm of honest labor is familiar and comforting as a heartbeat. The sun climbed higher, the day unfolded, and life on the Voss Ranch continued forward into whatever future they would build together. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one fence post at a time. And somewhere in the distance, in a cabin on good land with a strong barn standing beside it, a child who bore the Voss name was growing up knowing he was wanted, valued, and loved, not because of who his father was, but despite it. That was redemption. That was hope. That was the frontier at its best, harsh and unforgiving, but also offering second chances to those brave enough to take them and strong enough to see them through. The story that had begun with lies and betrayal ended with truth and honor. The man who'd lost everything found something better than what he'd had before. And the valley that had nearly been destroyed by greed was rebuilt by the kind of stubborn determination that made the West what it was. In the end, the frontier didn't reward bloodline or pride or charm. It rewarded the one who endured the storm, told the truth when lying would have been easier, and was strong enough to rebuild everything from the wreckage left behind. That man was Cade Mercer, and this was his home.